Chapter 1261. Are you all sure? Lionel frowned as he gazed toward his brothers. With all they had been through in the dimensional verse, the term brother had really gone from something they called each other in jest to something they truly meant. So Lionel couldn't help but feel a bitter taste in his mouth after he heard their decision. We're still a bit lacking like this, Leo. Joel nodded seriously. If we go to the Void Palace with you right now, we'll end up holding you back. And if you really let us go free, I'm certain that more than one of us would die, and that's not something I want to see. And I'm sure you don't want to see it either. Lionel knew that Joel was right. In fact, Lionel would make certain that he never had to see it. And the result of that would be, unsurprisingly, them holding him back. Despite knowing this, Lionel didn't like it. He had neglected these brothers of his for too long, and he felt like he owed them far more than he had given them. They never asked for anything from him, but that didn't mean that he didn't want to give back. There's no need to make that face, Cap. Raj laughed. We'll still be mooching off of you. Grammy said she'd take care of us, and those Luxnick's old fogies don't dare to fart too loud around us anymore. Lionel smiled and shook his head. Couldn't this guy be serious for once? Still, Raj's words did make him feel a lot better. The environment on Earth was still good, but the Milky Way was simply far too lacking. If these guys had spent the past year on planet Luxnix instead, Lionel had no doubt that their real talents would have shone through fiercely. Visit. For a better user experience, it seemed that he had overstepped by asking his mother to reserve spots for everyone. Eleanor had, of course, been willing to do it since Lionel had asked. But who would have thought that everyone would already have their own plans? Of his brothers, only the silent Arnold would be coming with Lionel. The rest chose to stay here, and would find a later opportunity to join. For now, they would solidify their foundations, learn more about their abilities, and slowly push themselves to the quasi-sixth dimension. Plus, Leo, I'm sure there are a lot of things here that you'll want us to handle, right? Joel met Lionel's gaze unwaveringly. Lionel slowly nodded. He still needed to care for the Oryx and the remnants of the Milky Way Guild. In addition, he had moving pieces that were still setting themselves up with the Umbra family, not to mention the secrets related to the Midas and Radix. This wasn't something he had forgotten about, but while he was in the Void Palace, it would be difficult to police these matters. His own mother hadn't even been allowed to leave on her own whims, but she was a sector-ranked disciple. Logically, then Lionel had no chance at moving freely after he entered their organization. Lionel had factored this into his plans already, and the reason he was okay with it was because there would surely be an exception made for when the Morales family air wars were set to begin. That would be his chance to leave and ensure that his pawns had all promoted as they should. But leaving things so hands-off for such a long period of time wasn't smart. It was especially a problem since his cousins-turned-competitors would definitely have their own men and women on the outside making moves for them. If Lionel didn't do the same, he would be handicapping himself. Thinking to this point, Lionel closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. When he opened them once more, he had regained his focus. All right, I will leave these matters to you. I'll find a method to establish communication with you all once I get to the Void Palace. Right. Joel grinned a rare smile. Lionel had one major flaw that maybe even he wasn't aware of. He was a control freak. If he could do something himself and not disrupt anyone else, he would rather do things that way. The day James betrayed them during the final game of the year, Lionel had realized what the problem was. Yet, instead of talking to anyone or even confronting James, he found a way to win the game by himself and preserve their friendship. When Lionel chose to show them his labs and the things he was working on like the tentacle womb and others, they had already felt closer to him than they ever had before. But now that feeling was even more potent. Lionel, Aina, Yuri, Sevon, Carolus, Noah, Arnold, Ulthar. Visit. For a better user experience, these 8 would be the representatives of Earth that made their way to the Void Palace. This was maybe the first time in all of history that a fifth-dimensional world had actually produced so many entries. In fact, it was rare for a fifth-dimensional world to even stumble upon an entry to begin with, let alone have such a display. Of course, there were others that had made it as well. The Luxniks had the best showing, though this was unsurprising. After years of suppressing themselves, they had blossomed forth and gained many nominal ranked spots. Eloquin, Siller and Elodie all gained spots in addition to a few ranked disciples within the top 10, making the total reach 8 alone. Though Aurinik felt that Lionel definitely didn't deserve the amethyst token, he could agree that there was no nepotism at play here. Of course, the ninth of the Luxniks was Miguel himself, who had, unsurprisingly, long since recovered. Among those unrelated to the Luxniks, though, there were only 4. One was a familiar young lady Lionel recognized, Rhea Sage. The second was Higlis, the now heir to the Montex family, who was now in a very awkward position. And the final 2 were both masked and exceptionally silent, but no one bothered them. However, at that moment, Aina, who hadn't spoken a word to Lionel in months, suddenly did so as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Visit. For a better user experience, King, I thought you should know about something that happened months ago. Lionel went from feeling like his bones were melting toward Aina calling him King, before he was suddenly enveloped by a flashbang of fury everyone but Aina and Miguel were forced to retreat from. He stretched out a hand and one of the masked men shot out, their throat landing in his palm as though it had always been there. Chapter 1262. Lionel would say that it had been a very long time since he had been this angry, but that would only be partially true. He was more enraged now than he had been with himself just a few months ago, and that was because this anger had nothing to do with him, but rather a very clear reverse scale of his mother. Lionel hadn't spent very long with his mother by his side, but those memories of affection he had with her as a child had been practically seared into his mind. Knowing that it wasn't her choice to leave his side only made these emotions easier to accept. The idea that someone would disrespect her left him infuriated to an extreme. The mask of the man that flew into Lionel's palm shattered, revealing the pale features and deep violet eyes of Richard. Of those here, maybe only a small percentage weren't surprised by this turn of events. It was unknown how this young man had managed to survive the ordeal of the Viola family, but none of that mattered now. Aina had been a part of Richard's schemes for a long while. Lionel never hid anything from her, so she was well aware that the Luxniks family was related to him. The trouble was that she didn't learn of what Richard had done until much later. Gradir's younger brother, Asen, had been caught by the Luxniks for daring to help in spreading the rumors. Aina's only task was to save him, but with her intelligence, it wasn't hard to piece together how these things were related. The Luxniks wouldn't just casually capture a member of the Viola family's main bloodline lineage without proper cause, especially when they were trying to lie low to begin with. When she saw the 2 masked figures, she was immediately suspicious. She had spent a long time with the Viola family, and was well aware of how cunning Richard was. But what was even more important was that Richard didn't gain this sort of character from himself. She simply didn't believe that the Viola family would have no contingency plans given a situation where they faced eradication. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, since she wasn't sure though. She only chose to tell Lionel a summary of those events and did nothing to point out the 2 masked young men. But, as she had expected, Lionel had known from the very beginning that these 2 masked young men were none other than Richard and Gradir. It was just that he simply hadn't cared. Lionel had been able to assign the energy signatures on the billboard to the contestants from the very beginning. He just hadn't seen much of a reason to target Richard. From his perspective, the 2 of them had only had a clash in the Dimensional Cleanse trial zone, but there was no reason to hold a grudge, especially since he had won that exchange. But now, things were different. You're responsible? Lionel's hand squeezed down on Richard's neck. Any stronger and he might snap it in 2. The latter tried to struggle and claw in Lionel's hand, but it felt like his nails were scratching against a metal plate. Not only did he not succeed, but he even ended up peeling his own nails back, resulting in a bloody mess that left his fingers mangled. The region fell into complete silence. Visit. For a better user experience, the envoys of the Void Palace had been preparing the teleportation portal, and Lionel's mother had been overseeing the progress. The region was the front gates of the Luxniks estate, and there wasn't much of a crowd to begin with aside from a few close friends and family members. Orinet couldn't help but frown as the situation now was completely different than it had been in the past. Richard could be considered an official disciple of the Void Palace, albeit nominal. He couldn't just be casually killed because Lionel felt like it, even if Lionel had the amethyst token. Richard's face went completely blue. He couldn't answer Lionel even if he wanted to. For some reason, he felt like there was dimensional suppression between the two of them despite the fact they were both within the fifth. In fact, his tier was still higher than Lionel's own. He couldn't even begin to believe the feelings of fear he was experiencing, but the humiliation was worse. If he hadn't guessed by now that the man Aina had always been comparing him to was Lionel, he wouldn't have earned half the intelligence those around him believed him to have. To know that he had lost so handily to Lionel more times than he even knew was enough to infuriate him to an extreme. It only made it worse that the goddess he had been chasing for so long was rejected by the very man before him. And yet, by some horrible twist of fate, was still by his side like an obedient little wife. It had taken all the self-control in the world for him not to show his anger, or leak any killing intent. He just wanted to put his head down and grasp this opportunity given to him by the Void Palace. Even though it is rare for nominal disciples to become true disciples, Richard didn't believe he would fail if he gave it everything he had. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience so. He buried his pride, his rage, his sadness to the deepest parts of his soul. But then in the greatest of ironies, it was the very woman who he had been chasing for so long that outed him in the end. He was under no illusion that he could be saved. He now knew who Lionel's mother was, and it only made him feel even more foolish for what he had done. However, Richard didn't want to give up, not here, not now. He couldn't. His eyes rolled to the back of his head, their whites flashing as blood seeped out from between his teeth. The harder he struggled, the quicker he seemed to approach the gates of death. Please show mercy. The voice came from none other than Gradier, the second masked man. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1263. When Lionel's gaze shifted to him, Gradier felt as though his mind was collapsing. It was just a single look, an indifferent glance, and yet it gripped at his soul, almost tearing it away from his body. The pressure was palpable to a degree that it almost manifested like tendrils of dark crimson in the air. Lionel didn't quite know who Gradier was, but Aina, who was still by his side, spoke a few simple words that made him understand what remained of the final pieces. It was then he understood that his mother's reputation had become collateral damage for an air war maybe no different to what he might experience in a few years' time. Though Lionel would soon find out that the scale of the Morales family air wars couldn't be compared to these petty games in the slightest. It might very well reach the point of it embroiling the whole of the human domain. And even if it didn't, it would most definitely grasp attention at least that far and wide. In truth, despite coming to understand things, Lionel didn't want to even give Richard a chance to live. He had never been very good at controlling his anger when it came to matters like this. And this certainly wasn't the first time he had flown into a rage for his mother's sake. Eleanor, though being the madwoman that she was, simply sent a glance back as though she was witnessing the most adorable thing ever, even going to the point of dabbing at her eyes with a fresh handkerchief. Gradier could tell that Lionel had no intention of listening to him, so he stepped forward, removing his mask. I know that what my cousin has done is irredeemable, but he is one of the final hopes my Viola family has. Am willing to exchange for his life. All of the most important treasures of the Viola family rest with us. I have heard of your Morales family from the envoys and know that your air wars are coming very soon. What we have could be invaluable to you. I know that you could just kill us and take them, but if you did this you would find that they won't work as they should and end up becoming a detriment rather than a help to you. Visit. For a better user experience, Gradier spoke as fast as he could, hoping that Lionel would at least care enough to stay his hand for the moment. While Richard had been hosting the envoys and basking in his new position, Gradier had taken a completely different approach. Richard had said himself that he lost some of his sharpness after finally gaining the position he had fought for his whole life. It was to the point he had almost exposed himself to Patriarch Luxnix. However, Gradier, who had lost the very same position, was still looking forward and hoping to find a new way for himself to make an impact. So when the envoys came to their family, While Richard had schemed to find a way to get Aina into his bed, Gradier was asking questions that would prepare him for the future. And that was when he learned the weight the Morales family held. Originally, Gradier simply wanted to understand the political landscape of the Void Palace and come to an understanding of who held the largest centers of power. Never would he have expected that the boy who had been stricken from the Luxnix family records was actually related to one of these behemoths. In truth, Gradier didn't actually know that Lionel was an heir candidate. He simply thought that even if he wasn't, a vast amount of resources would be valuable nonetheless. If the Morales heir wars worked like most did, then this wasn't just a jockeying of position for the heirs themselves, but also for their subordinates. Everyone who had backed Gradier found their lives to become 100 times harder all of a sudden, while it was the opposite for everyone who had followed Richard. Little did Gradier know that Lionel was indeed one of the heirs. Visit. For a better user experience contrary to Gradier's expectations, though, Lionel didn't even waver when he heard such enticement. Why should I care? Lionel's hand squeezed down. Gradier's gaze flickered but eventually fell to despair. In their final plan, the Star Order Council equivalent of the Viola family had designed 2 spatial rings, one for Richard and the other for Gradier. Only by working together could they access 100% of the Viola family's legacy. It was a measure to ensure that the two of them would work together. What the Viola needed right now was stability, not infighting. Heir wars were a luxury of well-established families, something that they were decidedly not any longer. Toward this scene, the gazes of Orinik and the other envoys only became more odd and reserved. There was only so far that this nepotism should go. Allowing Lionel to kill a disciple was definitely way too far. It was hard to accept, but they also didn't dare to say anything either. But who could have expected that it was while Richard was on the brink of death that Eleanor would suddenly appear to press a hand down on Lionel's forearm? Mom. Lionel frowned. Visit. For a better user experience, he wasn't quite familiar with the rules of the Void Palace just yet, so he was unaware that there was an issue. Though he probably should have guessed, he was too pissed to care enough to think about it. It's just a few words. What are you getting so angry about? Are you going to fight everyone that says something about me? Yes. Lionel replied without hesitation. Eleanor was stunned for a moment before she let off a light, airy laughter. While Lionel only saw his mother, the envoys and the others had to pay very special attention not to stare for too long, lest they have even worse luck than Richard. After she finished laughing, Eleanor finally spoke once again. He isn't wrong. You may very well need what they have. But Lionel's frown deepened. What could the Viola family have that he could possibly need? The Luxnix treasure vaults should be far beyond them. And then there was Stillwise Star Order's treasure deposits as well. Plus, even if he didn't have these things, he didn't like the idea of trading for forgiveness he didn't want to give. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, trust me. Eleanor laughed and shook her head. It seemed the Void Palace would be gaining another Morales family troublemaker with the way things were trending now. Chapter 1264. The whoosh sound of a formed portal caught everyone's attention. It swirled about with a radiant dark violet, and looked like a rotating nebula. Eleanor cast a glance and released her hold on Lionel's forearm. It seems it is time to go. Somewhat reluctantly, Lionel released his grip on Richard's throat. The latter fell to the ground heavily, coughing and wheezing. It took several moments for the color to return to his face, and several more for his lightheadedness to vanish. Richard grit his teeth hard, but he restrained himself, relaxing his body in the next instant. If it wasn't for the somewhat vacant look in his eyes, one would have never guessed that something had happened. Well, that and the fact there was already a clear bruise in the shape of a hand around his throat. He rose from the ground slowly, but steadily. Follow me. Eleanor said lightly. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. There was a certain heaviness in Eleanor's tone right this moment. It wasn't because she feared for herself, but rather because she wasn't naive enough to believe that her actions would have no effect on her son. In fact, she was certain that it would be the direct opposite. As a mother, she couldn't help herself. Worrying was what she did. Even if her husband had been watching Lionel like a hawk right this moment, and even knowing the kind of strength he had, she would still be worrying. The Void Palace had its rules that protected disciples, but there were too many ways around them, and they could only be enforced within its territory. And Velasco had many enemies that had more than enough leeway to ignore these rules all on their own. Of course, whether they would dare to do so was a different matter entirely, but there were several more ways for them to make things difficult. They knew Val's personality well enough to know that they would get away with it too. While Eleanor looked like a reckless mother who had done as she pleased to save her son, the reality was that she had only gone so far because she needed to give her little lion every advantage he could get, because the truth was, he was already lagging far behind. The step through the portal was unlike anything Lionel had ever experienced before. It was far less subtle than his transportation to the dimensional cleanse trial world, and felt a lot like his body was being stretched into a thin string, as though all his nerve centers had been shut down and his limbs were being pulled into a tight tube. Visit. For a better user experience when his vision cleared, and he could finally feel his feet beneath him once again, the world around him was even more of a shock than the initial feeling. Lionel had thought that he had seen a lot of the dimensional verse already. Or more accurately, his talks with Wise Star Order over the past few months had made it feel like his horizons had been broadened beyond the scope of even his previous imagination. However, the scene he saw before him now still took his breath away. There was no world, no planet, no moon. The Void Palace was just an enormous obsidian mountain range, floating in the depths of space and hanging upon a vast nothingness. The sheer size alone was impossible for a normal human to fathom. The distance from its base to its lowest peak was taller than the diameter of 3 planets stacked on top of one another, and its highest was more than 5. As for its width, it was as much as 10 planets wide. This alone was astonishing enough that Lionel found it hard to wrap his brain around just how such a construct could even have been formed. But that was when his breath was taken away by the gates. The Paifong were even more glorious than the mountain range itself. Of course, this was partly due to the fact that the obsidian mountain that made up the Void Palace's territory seemed to be covered by a thin veil of protection, stopping Lionel from observing it as deeply as he wanted. Author's note: a Paifong is a Chinese-style gate/archway visit. For the best know_vel_read_ing experience, they towered for thousands kilometers, the centerpiece of each one of their archways containing what looked like a miniature blazing white star, providing the only sort of contrast to the endless blackness in the surroundings. While the mountain range seemed an almost infinite distance away, the Paifong were close, almost too close. They bore down with a haunting momentum that made the valiant heart pillars Lionel had experienced before seem like nothing more than child's play. It felt like these gates were the linchpin that kept everything in place. They protected the Void Palace despite not having doorways and acted as passageways simultaneously. It was only then the shocking question hit Lionel like a ton of bricks. The mountain was over there, and the gates were there, but they all hung in a vast and empty space. So, what the hell was he standing on? Lionel looked down, his pupils constricting when he realized that he wasn't standing on anything at all. There was nothing between him and an endless abyss. Usually this wouldn't be a big deal. After all, in space like this, there shouldn't have been a need to worry about gravity inevitably leading him to a crushing death. But he could very clearly tell which way was up and which way was down in this place. Just what was going on? Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ing experience before Lionel could think about it any further, the closest Paifong word to life, the shadow of several figures stepping outward. Lionel couldn't seem to see through any one of them, but he could tell that each one was unfathomable. Orinik and the other envoys seemed to be snapped awake right that moment, hurriedly bowing in greeting. However, these figures didn't spare them a single glance as a woman at the center of them all frowned deeply, her gaze having been locked onto Eleanor the entire time. What is the meaning of this, Eleanor? Your sector is several months late. Chapter 1265. There were 3 individuals who stepped out, all dressed in elaborate robes wrapped in violet, blacks and silvers. It seemed to paint the picture of swirling a nebula, and was most definitely a beautiful contrast in colors and construction. It took no more than this for Lionel's cool uniform senses to tingle once again. He had already forgotten the weight of the conversation, looking them up and down as though he could already envision himself wearing it. For someone who didn't care about how he dressed much, Lionel was very much obsessed with how well the organizations he joined did in this fashion. But maybe only he was aware of the reason why this was late. Eleanor asked lightly. Her demeanor seemed to have completely shifted. There was nothing left of a loving mother, and there was only a calm indifference left. The pressure she exuded multiplied several times over, causing the brows of the woman who had stepped forward to furrow. Of the three that had appeared, all of them were sector-ranked disciples and were, as such, well acquainted with one another. The young woman who spoke was maybe the most powerful of the three, and as such had spoken on their behalf. But, even though her words were laced with an impatience and hardly concealed anger, if it was contrasted with how furious she had been earlier, it would be obvious to anyone that she was being reserved right this moment, and only became more so after Eleanor had spoken. The last group before yours arrived over a month and a half ago. What possible explanation could you have for delaying us all for so long? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Lionel had originally been paying attention to the subtleties of the conversation. He could see that power dynamic here, and it was quite clear that his mother was a step above. It seemed that even though she couldn't be as rampant as Velasco, she had her own small hegemon. However, Lionel's attention was soon pulled away by something else. Orinik and the other envoys who had stepped forward to bow in respect were a bit off. It took Lionel a moment, but he realized that they were actually still trying to adjust to the long-scale teleportation. When he noticed this, his attention shifted once again to those around him, and he noticed that even Aina and Miguel still had a deep frown marring their foreheads, their eyes tightly closed and their bodies trembling somewhat. It looked as though they still felt like they were teleporting. Lionel would soon realize, though, that this conclusion of his was wrong. Yip. Yip. At that moment, Little Black Star shot out from Lionel's spatial ring, catching him off guard. Little Black Star appeared and vanished whenever the little guy felt like it, but he rarely appeared in situations where Lionel wasn't alone, at least not so suddenly. The little guy excitedly jumped around, appearing and vanishing as he pleased. When he flashed back to Lionel's head or hair, he didn't seem ready to rest and still continued to hop around. Visit. For a better user experience. Yip. Yip. Lionel smiled. Alright. I get it, you're excited. Yip. Yip. The expression of the woman darkened before it suddenly flashed with a hint of surprise. She realized that by Lionel's style of dress that he wasn't yet a disciple, but he had recovered already? And that little creature, adjusting to this place, was more than just about the teleportation over. It would make sense for Little Black Star to be fine as he hadn't had to take the brunt of the travel over. However, not only was this region a seventh-dimensional world that sat at the very pinnacle, far beyond what most had ever experienced, there was also a dense concentration of anarchic force in the general surroundings that made it feel as though you were breathing in poison constantly. Of course, this dense concentration was only a few parts per billion. But this concentration was already enough to make a person feel greatly uncomfortable. The fact Lionel had already adjusted made little sense. Void Palace was designed this way on purpose. Even though they had the technology to make the density of anarchic force negligible, it was best to get the disciples accustomed to this right now. This would only get worse on the void battlefield. But how was this tiny, insignificant creature doing just fine? Visit. For a better user experience. Eleanor seemed not to have heard her son's outburst at all. Instead, she replied just as evenly as she originally did. What do their early arrivals have to do with me? There is no deadline and every selection is left up to the discretion of the overseer. Mine just happened to take longer. The woman snapped her attention back to Eleanor when she heard this. Her expression couldn't help but twitch. What Eleanor said was true. But this all had to be within reason. This was taking things to an extreme, especially since several exceptions had been made already. However, when the woman thought about how all the other youths had had months to adjust to this environment while Eleanor's group wouldn't have this luxury, her mind shifted toward an internal sneer. Your words are just as fault-proof as they always are, Lady Eleanor. But I still must inform you that the higher-ups aren't satisfied with how this selection has lagged behind the others in schedule. It's been decided that your sector will only be given 3 hours to adjust upon arrival. Following this grace period, the true selection will start immediately. I will be overseeing a large portion of these matters, so I will not allow any delay. Despite having expected such an outcome, Eleanor still frowned deeply, much to the satisfaction of Asenna. 3 hours was definitely excessively short. She had hoped that they would receive at least a day. Clearly, those old fogies were throwing their weight around. At that moment, though, a flash of violet caught Eleanor's attention out of the corner of her eye. She looked over to find her son twirling the heavy amethyst token as though it weighed as light as a feather, dancing it between his fingers with a deft skill only possible by someone with an impossibly high-grade designation. Visit. For a better user experience, the token flipped in the air, and a satisfying slap was heard as Lionel caught it again. His gaze twinkled as his mind drifted to the moment Aina had handed it to him. Then he smiled confidently. Leave it to me, Mom. Chapter 1266. Asenna's pupils constricted when she noticed the amethyst token. However, her shock in seeing it was far less than hearing what Lionel addressed Eleanor as. There was no one who didn't understand who that man's wife was, and there was probably even less who didn't understand that the two had a child between them. Though this might sound like an odd way to frame those matters, if one knew the kind of commotion that was caused around Lionel's birth, it would be much easier to explain. The Void Palace had many strict rules. Among them there were regulations around pregnancy and conceiving children. As such, it was no surprise then that Lionel's birth had quite a lot of controversy surrounding it. Though these rules sounded quite barbaric from the perspective of the Void Palace, it made a lot of sense. They were raising up the protectors of the domain, and the responsibility placed on the shoulder of their disciples was completely unlike anything one would find from another organization. In such a strict environment, where there were hardly any barriers between men and women, one could imagine what these sort of stress-filled conditions would lead to. At the end of the day, men and women were two sides of the same coin and complemented one another. Left to their own devices, it was inevitable that they would pair up, and if there were no sort of regulations around these matters, it could negatively affect and compromise the ability of the Void Palace to function as it was meant to. In almost any other situation, Eleanor would have been executed and Velasco would follow not long after. However, in this one, well, it could only be said that Lionel's father was a bit of a madman. The Void Palace had already reached a point of not wanting to provoke Val too much after what had happened following Lionel's grandfather's death. However, they still had to make a showing for this matter. The rules were important, and they couldn't just allow anyone to break them as they pleased. Unfortunately, Velasco hadn't felt like tiptoeing around the matter and playing their games, leading to the second time Void Palace was almost flipped on its head. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience as such, when the 3 sector ranked disciples looked toward Lionel, what they saw was more than just a boy holding an amethyst token. They found instead a ticking time bomb in human form. Eleanor sighed. Lionel could have easily kept these matters to himself for a longer period of time. It might have been more advisable to do so, and it would have made certain things far easier. But he had actually purposely chosen this route. Well, never mind. He's so adorable when he calls me Mom. A smile bloomed on Eleanor's features. With a wave of her hand, the struggling youths were cradled by a gentle energy and risen into the air. They were so supremely focused on regaining control of their bodies that they didn't even notice the change. Well, you've heard my son. If you're finished now, you can move out of the way. Eleanor walked forward without another word, guiding the youths into the gate. Lionel, who followed after her, took another look around, a curious glint in his eye before his gaze fell on Asenna. For some reason, he felt the need to memorize her face. Beneath Lionel's scrutiny, Asenna's frown deepened, but the smile on his face couldn't help but remind her of a certain man. A reality that only made her pretty features snarl a bit. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel didn't miss this change at all, and even felt somewhat inwardly amused. He had a few guesses as to why this woman would react this way to his face despite how polite he was being. Still, he didn't lose his smile. "My name is Lionel Morales. Nice to meet you, Overseer. Thank you in advance for your future impartial judgment, and I'm sorry about the long wait. I'll do my best to make sure we fall more in line with the coming rules." Asena was stunned for a moment before she realized her reaction was a bit off. But that only made her stern expression become somewhat of a blush. Damn it, this little brat is just like his playboy father. Lionel nodded in respect to the two men by Asena's side before continuing on after his mother. Though her face was looking away, the smile on Eleanor's face could hardly be contained. Deep within the Void Palace, the arrival of Lionel and his mother didn't go unnoticed. With how important this location was, it was simply impossible that anything could slip their attention. From the moment the portal had been formed, they were already aware of who was coming, how many there would be, and how powerful they were. It seems like that day has finally come. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. An aged voice spoke into the shadows. The room made the concentration of anarchic force in the surroundings of Void Palace look like child's play. However, these were among the most valuable training rooms of the organization. When controlled in this fashion, the continuous suppression caused by anarchic force, followed by a period of relief, could cause great growth in a warrior's strength. For older individuals reaching the end of their potential, these dangerous methods were more of the norm, and it wasn't a surprise for many of them to share rooms like this as they oversaw matters. In the end, they were the true backbone of the human domain, and needed to push themselves as such. I was told that the boy suffered a grievous wound after his birth, but it seems that he's recovered just fine. Though being only at Tier 5 of the 5th dimension at his age considering his background, is definitely lacking. Another silence fell over the room before another spoke. Send Cornelius to oversee these matters. This generation is a bit too volatile. Hums of agreement resounded. But under a layer of their ambience was a silent and tacit understanding. They were all aware what a volatile generation like this one represented. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience. Chapter 1267. Orinik and the others kept their heads lowered the entire time, not wanting to get involved in these matters. They didn't have a mother like Eleanor to rely on, so staying low was the best option they had for now. What Orinik didn't expect, though, was that he would be stopped. Hold. Asena's voice sounded not long after Eleanor vanished. The rest of you can go. You stay. Orinik's lowered gaze flashed for a moment, as though he was calculating something. He could hear the shuffling feet around him, as though the other ranked disciples vanished one after another, leaving him behind. Though Ganner hesitated for a moment, he ultimately did as he was told and vanished as well. Asena, one of the male sector ranked disciples who had followed after her, looked toward her with a questioning gaze. There wasn't exactly anything wrong with what Asena was doing, but it was definitely a gray zone, especially since he could guess the kind of questions she would ask. For the sake of maintaining their facade of equality and fairness, the Void Palace took several measures, not the least of which were the rules surrounding the selection process. Usually, Eleanor wouldn't even be allowed to be an overseer as she would be biased toward her sector, but even that potential trouble was mitigated by the true selection set to take place in 3 hours. That said, in order to prevent the spread of rumors, fellow overseers weren't meant to question the methods of their colleagues either. If no one was asking questions, then there wouldn't be scandals to be found. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, this was to say that Asena's act in stopping Orinik was most definitely towing a vague line that she may very well have already crossed. However, she didn't mind her fellow sector-ranked disciple in the slightest as she asked her question. I don't want to question Lady Eleanor's methods, I'm only very curious. They were several months late, and they even handed out an amethyst token. How could I not be intrigued? This year, there was only one other amethyst token given. Orinik's gaze flickered once more, but his head remained downward as he knew these words weren't directed at him, but were rather a method of Asena using semantics to absolve herself of responsibility. What was more shocking, though, was that there was only one other amethyst token given out. While it was true that they were exceptionally rare and only a handful would be given out every selection round, this was still a matter of relativity. Though Orinik had said in his speech that there were many years not a single amethyst token would be handed out, he had only exaggerated for impact. This was a usual approach the envoys took, because the criteria for handing out an amethyst token were so vague that there would often be geniuses who thought they were greatly deserving who would cause a commotion over them. It would be fine if it was just the genius alone who acted, but if their family got involved as well, it could lead to a messy situation. So it was best if they all believed it was far out of their reach. Only when they came to the Void Palace would they understand the truth. Of course, this wasn't to say that the amethyst token was some ubiquitous thing. There were tens of thousands of sectors in the human domain, and only a handful of amethyst tokens would be given out. But if what Asena said was true, that meant that this year there would only be one who was truly deserving of it. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. That was unheard of. Obviously, Orinik didn't count Lionel among this number. In his view and any objective person's view, it was a matter of clear nepotism. If not for this, he would have never laid a finger on such a reward. This only meant one of two things. Either this generation was so devoid of talent that hardly anyone was worth it, or this generation was so talented that no single person could seem to claim a sector for themselves. And Orinik had a sneaking suspicion that it was the latter. It seemed that Lionel would have to suffer for his mother's kindness. A small smile curled his lips as he kept his head lowered. Orinik would be lying if he said he didn't get a small bit of satisfaction from this. His life in the Void Palace was very hard, and he had to scratch and claw for everything. And soon, Lionel would realize that there were some things that couldn't just be handed to you on a silver platter no matter who your mommy or daddy was. Explain the events of the selection to us. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Hearing these words finally aimed toward him, Orinik didn't hesitate to explain everything he knew. He didn't embellish anything as there was simply no need to. The truth spoke for itself. The amused expression in Asena's eyes only grew with every passing moment. She had thought that there would be some things to nitpick at here and there, but she had never thought that Eleanor would actually be so brazenly biased. She almost couldn't refrain from laughing out loud. In addition, judging by the recounting, that man's son was definitely far weaker than he was at that age. It seemed that she had overestimated him because of how easily he had adapted to the anarchic force. But guessing by the rest of the story, Asena wouldn't even be surprised if Eleanor had delayed things for so long to use some artificial method to prepare Lionel for this environment. Though Asena was incorrect about this, she still felt like this was the most logical guess. Or why else would Eleanor put such a brazen target on her son's back? To need several months to adapt to this level of anarchic force. Asena shook her head. It seems that your otherwise pure genes have been tainted by the trash that is your mother. That man had so many women to choose from. And yet she chose a pathetic galaxy-ranked disciple to ruin his lineage with. How strong would our children have been? We could have built an empire. But you actually chose that nameless bitch from a sixth-dimensional family. Asena's irises turned a darker shade before she calmed. Her expression still the picture of stillness. Visit. For a better user experience, she would enjoy this very much. Chapter 1268. Asena didn't interrupt Orinik at all, allowing him to speak until he finished the final word. By the end of it all, even the more neutral male sector-ranked disciples had weird expressions on their faces. It was clear and obvious that Eleanor had gone too far. Even though the requirements of the amethyst token were quite vague, they were obvious enough to draw a clear line far ahead of where Lionel stood. Once Orinik finished, Asena smiled. Thank you for your explanation. This year, the true selections will be a bit different as the number of talents has grown so exponentially. Doing things the normal way won't work any longer, as we wouldn't want those who had proved themselves worthy to fall through the cracks. In order to facilitate these new methods, as the overseer, I'll be needing a few helpers to help inform the large amounts of youths under my charge and spread my orders. Orinik's heart skipped a beat when he heard this. Another opportunity, one maybe even better than what he would have gained selling information about Lionel's appearance. No, he could take advantage of both. There was not even a need to choose. This was obviously Asena's subtle way of telling him to make sure as many people learned of these matters as possible. This was the kind of news that would spread eventually anyway. It wasn't as though Eleanor had taken any measures to silence them. But it seemed that Asena wouldn't be satisfied with just this alone. Yes. It would be my honor. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Asena's smile deepened. Having crossed the barrier, the pressure around Lionel seemed more palpable. He had never truly felt the changes when shifting between dimensional worlds. And it still wasn't very exaggerated this time. But he still felt as though the air around him had become a touch heavier. Whether it was breathing or moving, it felt like a thin film of plastic had coated Lionel's body, making him slightly uncomfortable. But this was all. In fact, the feeling only took a few moments to vanish, as though he had torn the sheet of plastic from himself. Finally, he could look around his surroundings, but what he saw was almost as unexpected as the shock of the Void Palace's grandeur. Everything in this place seemed touched by darkness. The ground was coarse and littered with gray soil and black rock. The skies were perpetually overcast without the slightest hint of a sun's rays. And the air seemed to alternate in densities of fog. Sometimes one could see hundreds of meters ahead, and at other times, it felt difficult even to see your own hand before your face. However, this wasn't why Lionel was confused. Before him, there was a small village that seemed completely out of place. Most of the surroundings were made up of simple houses built of black wood. They were only about 3 meters wide and deep and barely about 2 meters tall, maybe a bit over. There was no great organization to them, though simple roads seemed to have been formed around them. Around these wooden cabins, or more toward the center of this odd village, there were larger structures. There was what seemed to be a smithy, an herb exchange, a healer's office, and also a handful of food exchanges. Visit. For a better user experience with just a glance, Lionel could sense several powerful auras resting in this odd makeshift village. Though he looked toward his mother for an explanation, her gaze didn't seem to give anything away. I will have to leave you all here. From what I can tell, little lion, these true selections will be different from the past, so there isn't much I can do to help you. Eleanor was going to continue to speak, but her gaze suddenly narrowed, shifting up to the sky. But all that was there was a vast foggy canopy, and even in the few areas you could see through to the sky, there were nothing but more gray clouds waiting. There wasn't much a difference between them and fog to begin with. With a thought, Eleanor gently placed the youths down, and turned toward Lionel with a light smile on her face. Don't cause too much trouble, all right? Lionel raised an eyebrow, looking down at his mother. After a moment he too looked up into the skies. But this time, he sent his internal sight in a straight beam. It was completely invisible to the naked eye, and yet those with sensitive senses were immediately placed on alert, the attention of several shifting toward the entrance of the small village. Unfortunately, Lionel still found nothing. I guess the difference really is big. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Eleanor was stunned for a moment before she shook her head. The son that she had watched grow up was always so obedient and perfect. How had things become like this? Of course, Eleanor's smile only became brighter. And soon, the flaws she saw in her son just this moment were painted over and assimilated into her memories of him being obedient and perfect, perpetuating the cycle all over again. Be safe and protect the others. It's because of me that they're at such a disadvantage, Lionel nodded. I'll make sure nothing happens to them. Good. Eleanor ruffled her son's hair before vanishing before his eyes, leaving him staring at the expanse of the village. Up in the skies, a man with a face obscured by a mask stood, his robes fluttering and his eyes narrowed. While it was true that Lionel hadn't been able to sense him, that beam of internal sight had gone right through his forehead. With how vast the skies were, and how thin Lionel had made the line, the odds of such a perfect strike was completely unfathomable. There was no coincidence, he had done it on purpose. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, this brat is just as arrogant as his father, still unwilling to take a loss. These matters will be annoying to deal with. Cornelius mumbled to himself, his voice deep and grating. Chapter 1269. Lionel gazed up at the skies once more after his mother had left, but chose to leave those matters be. He really only used a small trick to pinpoint that mysterious person's location. It was as easy as calculating the line of his mother's sight and the distance at which her gaze focused, then reverse engineering it from his location. With his current mental capacity and the fact his mother wasn't on guard against him, obviously, it was as easy as breathing. Yip. Yip. Lionel retracted his gaze and took little Blackstar into his arms. With a sigh he looked around. The youths of Earth, planet Luxnix, planet Montex and planet Viola, not to mention Raya, were all now sitting in meditation. Some of them looked far more uncomfortable than the others, but at this pace, there was simply no way they would be prepared in just 3 hours. Old man, what do you think? Is there a way to speed up this process? Lionel couldn't very well continue to talk with the old man out loud, so he had learned a method of doing so with his internal sight thanks to the Luxnix vast store of manipulation-type techniques. This made things far more convenient as well. Anarchic force isn't a joke, kid. There's no speeding up the process. Doing so will just kill them. I have a feeling that the only reason you are fine is because you suffered for days pulling it out of your body, so you've already undergone a baptism of a far higher concentration. Speaking of which, if it's so volatile in such a low concentration, why did I never notice that so much was in my body? The anarchic force came when you stole energy from the regulator, and that energy was immediately used to fuel your innate node's ridiculous growth. It's more likely than not that it was your innate node that stored it all, protecting you from it. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience when you reconnected your nodal pathways, it finally gained an outlet to expel it all. Lionel nodded. These were his thoughts as well. He felt that he could sense his innate node with even more clarity than he had before now, so it was clear that something had been obstructing it. Lionel suddenly turned his head back, but the envoys he had been expecting to find weren't there. Or rather, there was only one of them, Orinik. He followed behind Asena, but even the other 2 sector-ranked disciples were nowhere to be seen. The only explanation was that while they had all entered the same Paifang, that didn't mean they would all end up at the same location. Clearly there were methods of controlling this that Lionel wasn't aware of just yet. A lot of attention had already been aimed toward Lionel's location due to his sudden use of internal sight, so when Asena, a sector-ranked disciple, appeared, the attention toward this region only grew. Soon, a few figures stepped out from their blackwood cabins, their gazes observing Lionel and the other newcomers. But seeing their silent struggle against anarchic force, each one of them had a different reaction. Some were pensive, others sneered, and others remained indifferent. This last group was maybe the one Lionel paid the most attention to. Asena ignored these observers and trained her own indifferent gaze toward Lionel. Without Eleanor being here, the pressure she gave off was far less restrained. Despite her being more than a full head shorter than Lionel, she might as well have been a towering mountain to him. The strength hidden within that petite body of hers was undeniable. At that moment, though, something Asena hadn't been expecting occurred. A young lady that dwarfed her beauty in every way, shape and form appeared by Lionel's side. Her face was pale to an extreme and her body was trembling from head to toe, but she still struggled to stand shoulder to shoulder with Lionel, bearing Asena's pressure along with him. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience, it felt that everyone's attention was immediately diverted to this young woman. She looked like the perfect image of a gorgeous fairy, her black hair falling like a glistening waterfall and her golden irises flickering like 2 radiant stars. In this bleak atmosphere, she looked to be the only light. While everyone else was enraptured, though, Lionel frowned. You haven't adjusted yet, go back and meditate. Aina didn't take her gaze away from Asena immediately. But we don't have time. Aina said lightly. You'll have all the time you need. Aina's gaze finally shifted away from Asena to meet Lionel's. Her lips gave way to a smile, her pale expression making her look like a frail flower one should protect with their entire being. Yes, my king. Aina obediently turned back and returned to her meditation, her beautiful voice being carried by the wind, and making the day seem just that much brighter. Toward her actions, though, despite his expression not showing it, Lionel could only smile bitterly on the inside. The latest _AP_SODIES are on website. No matter what his mother did, there would never be any greater aggros than a woman with beauty beyond words. Just the act of Aina stepping to Lionel's side had already lit a fire in several eyes. However, her form of address to him was like a barrel of explosive oil poured over it all. Lionel's gaze turned back to Asena, meeting hers. A flicker of red and violet danced in his eyes, his king's might swimming between tangible and intangible. The momentum Asena had built up seemed worthless. Asena's gaze narrowed. But, once again, she inwardly found another opportunity. A generational goddess was more motivation for some than even an amethyst token. I've come to tell you all that the true selection will begin in 3 hours. The others have already been briefed on what to expect and how to prepare, but you latecomers will have to rely on yourselves to figure out what is coming. All I can tell you is that if you want a cabin and a place to rest, you'll have to build it yourself. And if you want to buy things from the smithy or rent the services of a healer, you will only be able to do so with void points, as outside currencies are useless here. Good luck. Asena vanished, leaving Lionel as the only line of defense between over a dozen meditating and vulnerable youths, and a group of geniuses from across the human domain. Visit for a better user experience. Chapter 1270. Lionel turned his gaze away from the youths before him. He couldn't just leave them here, but it seemed he would have to if he wanted to find out what was going on in this place. There was no way he could trust these people who had a vested interest in having as little competition as possible with the well-being of his people. Blackstar, you stay here and protect them. Yep. Yep. If anything goes wrong, you can just reach out to me. I will return immediately. Yep. Little Blackstar leapt out of Lionel's arms and softly landed on Aina's lap. The little guy scurried around in a state of half familiarity and half hesitation. Though little Blackstar couldn't speak like a human, his thoughts were no less complex and his connection with Lionel was very deep. Because of this, the little guy was aware of a great many things, though its summation couldn't be articulated. In the end, though, little Blackstar's tense body relaxed and his hesitation drifted away. Scurrying up Aina's arm, he found a resting spot on her shoulder before giving Lionel a reassuring twitch of his long whiskers. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Lionel immediately got the gist of little Blackstar's thoughts. They were something to the effect of, I won't let anyone touch a single hair on her head. Toward such a thing, he could only speechlessly shake his head. He had said to protect everyone. How had this little runt interpreted things that way? Forget it, little Blackstar wouldn't sit idly by if any one of them was attacked. Lionel tapped his foot on the ground, causing several beast constructs to slowly take form. Interesting. It feels a bit sluggish manipulating force here. I'm still a bit too used to snatching energy from the atmosphere, though. It would have been much faster if I relied on my internal force instead. Habits built over several years took time to break, and the few days Lionel had weren't enough. Luckily, with the control tier of his ability slowly coming under his wing more and more every day, Lionel was better suited to breaking bad habits than almost anyone else in existence. The beast constructed Lionel formed were practically invisible to the naked eye, and relied on a lot of the concepts he had used in forming the spider beast construct he had prepared for Aina's father. But now they only had a small amount of spatial properties, but were mostly designed to be Lionel's eyes and ears. Once this was finished, Lionel turned toward the village once more, strolling forward. However, he had only made it to the line of the outer borders when he suddenly found that his road forward was blocked by a singular young man. Visit. For a better user experience, nothing in particular stood out about this person. He had normal black hair and he wasn't too tall, being a head shorter than Lionel himself. He had a broad and stocky build and made his shoulders appear to be quite strong, and his irises seemed a bit blacker than would be natural, but considering the low light of the surroundings, it could have just as easily been an illusion of the eye. Still, he stood before Lionel quite confidently, his expression not really giving much away. Lionel towered over him, his hands carelessly loose within his pockets. Despite the 3-hour time limit, he didn't seem to be in a rush at all. standing in place and meeting the gaze of this young man without much difficulty. As silent as the space between the two of them was, the gravel and rocks that surrounded them shifted ever so slightly from time to time. Under such pressure, it was very much possible that the ground of a fifth-dimensional world would have long been grinded into fine sand. Lionel shifted his gaze away from the young man, looking past him and seeing that many of the youths who had stepped out of their cabins had yet to return. Their purpose wasn't entirely clear, but if there was a simple method to get rid of competition and variables, why wouldn't they take it? They had all come with support systems of their own. But it was very obvious that Lionel was alone. Taking him out would only be a matter of a small effort. Once he was dealt with, dealing with the rest while they were so vulnerable would be as easy as breathing. Lionel fell into thought for a moment. On the one hand, he didn't particularly want to start off his days in this place on the wrong foot. But on the other, the latest _AP_SODs are on the website. Orinik had already silently vanished into the village, and though he hadn't said anything to Lionel, there were too many oddities about his appearance here. Between our entering the gates and his appearance with that lady, there were 3 minutes that passed. It's an odd time dilation if there was always a plan to be here. Even if it was a last-minute addition, 3 minutes is a bit on the longer side. Though not long enough that it's too suspicious either. Plus, is being the nice guy here even possible? I already tried with that lady, and yet the first thing she did when she faced me again was try to pressure me once more. There's also that guy in the skies, but he's probably only here to make sure that things actually follow the rules since Mom didn't tell me anything about him. In that case, Lionel sighed. Bringing a hand out of his pockets, he ran his fingers through his hair. Of their 3-hour timer, half a minute had already passed, and even more was only ticking by. He couldn't very well have to fight everyone in this village, right? No, that wasn't the proper way to think of things. He would just have to make sure that that thought never even crossed their minds. The pupils of the young man before Lionel suddenly constricted, but it was already too late. A claw-like hand had appeared hovering above his head. Lionel's gaze down toward him now having become a frightening cold. The latest _AP_SODs are on the website. I'm a bit ignorant of the rules here. Can I kill this ant? The words seemed spoken at nobody, and yet the figure in the sky knew quite well they were for him. Chapter 1271. The young man had no idea when Lionel's hand had appeared above his head. And yet, despite the fact there was no actual physical touch between them, he could still feel an undeniable pressure squeezing down, making his eyes feel as though they might pop out of their sockets at any moment. The pressure was palpable, his knees shaking and bending, a cold sweat coating his back and forehead, and veins popping up across his body. He didn't even dare to take a step forward or back, in fear that any such action might lead to his inevitable death. Oh, Lionel spoke again. No response. A smile crept across Lionel's face, but the coldness that remained in his eyes made it feel like the call of a devil. The young man didn't dare to shift his gaze away, and yet he was praying and hoping that he could look at something else, anything else. The impact on his psyche was even more damning than the impact on his body. He felt all the bits and pieces of his cobbled-together confidence crumbling one after another. Lionel shrugged. You saw it for yourself, right? The only rules our supposed overseer let us know of is the fact that I have to build cabins for myself. But, she never said what would happen if I just killed one of you and took it for myself. If my hand slipped and I made a mistake, could it really be blamed on me? Once again, Lionel's words were met with nothing more than silence. However, his smile only became brighter, morphing into a toothy grin as flickers of crimson danced within his eyes. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience an oppressive fog of violet and red began to rise, his short hair dancing about ever so slightly in the upswing of force. It seems that no one cares if you die. Goodbye. Lionel's forearm bulged, veins dancing with power manifesting as he clamped downward. The horrid screech of the boy came next. It was the kind of pained cry that sent shivers down one's spine. In many ways, it only made it worse that he was facing away from the few spectators that remained. Their own imaginations filled in the blanks for what kind of horrible expressions he was making with his head under that kind of pressure. That's enough. The voice was calm and unhurried, and yet enveloped the whole of the surroundings. Lionel's strength was snuffed out with a slight breeze, vanishing as though it had never been there. Even he couldn't help but be surprised. To eliminate someone's strength like that without hurting them in the slightest was definitely a shocking feat of skill. Lionel was very much impressed. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the young man collapsed to the ground, holding onto his head as he bled from his eyes, nose, ears, and mouth. He looked as though he had been tortured for a millennia, and no longer had the strength to pull himself back together. However, Lionel wasn't paying attention to him in the slightest. Instead, he had turned a gaze toward the sky, though the man was still much too far away to be seen by the likes of them. Lionel could finally make out his presence. The Void Palace has a strict mandate against killing. Its foundation is built upon creating the future leaders and protectors of the human race. You can push one another in battle for supremacy, but death will not be tolerated. The voice and the man's presence vanished after this. In truth, Cornelius really thought about letting Lionel kill the young man. If that happened, even though they wouldn't be able to punish Lionel the way they normally would due to the circumstances surrounding this matter, they could still expel him. That much would save them a great amount of headache in the future. But in the end, Cornelius chose against this line of action. Petty tricks like this only worked against those with backing they could ignore, and only further with those who actually cared about semantics and curving around the rules. That man, though, didn't give a damn. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Cornelius' gaze shifted toward a certain direction, landing in an inconspicuous place. It was only for the briefest of moments, but Asenna felt as though her head had been dunked into a vat of dry ice. Her body tensed up, and even long after Cornelius had turned his gaze away, she still didn't dare to make any sudden movements. That brat actually dared to use me in this way. Just give me one slip up, just a single one, and I'll make sure to spank you well in your father's stead. Cornelius hadn't had such an immature thought decades, and didn't even realize there was anything wrong with it until several days later. Unfortunately, over time, he would soon learn that this was just the kind of effect Lionel had on people. Lionel smiled brightly on the ground. This time, the coldness that had suffused it was nowhere to be seen. However, the fact there was a young man writhing in pain on the ground before him didn't help his image very much at all. Thank you for your guidance. Lionel respectfully thanked the invisible man above him, and stepped over the young man who was still clinging to his head. That's one minor problem dealt with, but I still didn't end up getting an explanation for everything else. It seems I'll still have to find out for myself. Lionel's gaze quickly swept the village and he entered. The latest _AP_SODIES are on website. He noticed a sign to the side that read, Village 0012. It was likely, then, that this was just one of many. However, whether that meant that the true selection would only encompass this one alone, or incorporate the others as well, was a relative unknown to him. I guess I should check the smithy first? I don't think there's much of a point in building cabins now, at least from my current understanding. What good is a house you can only use for 3 hours? But if there's a reason I should, then that answer would be found there. It's too odd that a culmination of geniuses from across the human domain, most of whom come from wealthy and well-off families, would need the services of a smithy at all. There's got to be a reason for that. Chapter 1272. When Lionel entered the village, he felt a shift in the force. He could feel its density and its heaviness, but he could also feel the difficulty in grasping and forcing this force to bend to your will. It was yet another great change from the region he had just been in. The realization made Lionel wonder a few things. Could it be that the Void Palace was split into tiers like this with ever-progressing density of energy? If that was the case, how far did it go? It was very possible that Lionel hadn't truly experienced the truth bulk of strength a world at the pinnacle of the 7th dimension could exude. Many still silently observed Lionel as he walked through the village, and the density of people only grew as he got closer to the village center. Lionel stuck out not only because of what he had done to the previous young man, but also because he was the only one who seemed to be walking alone. Likely as a sign of caution, Most of the youths here moved in pairs at a minimum, but many more walked in groups of 3 or 4, with 4 seeming to be the cap. There was a tense quiet that hung over the village, and Lionel could imagine that it had been like this for a long while. None of these people would relax until they had confirmed their entry into the Void Palace. Little did they know, though, that the true nightmare only began once this threshold was crossed. Of course, Lionel was oblivious to all of this as well, but he could understand these people. 99% of them were nominal disciples who had barely been able to scrape by and gain a position. There was only 1 amethyst token and 3 golden tokens to be given out. And even if you were the top 4 strongest in your sector, you weren't guaranteed any one of them if you didn't meet a certain standard. Knowing this, it was no wonder so many of them were nervous and on guard. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience this year seemed to have far more participants than usual, and that meant far more enemies. They all had to keep their heads on a swivel, especially when it came to newcomers and unknown variables like Lionel and the others. Lionel, though, was observing them for a vastly different reason. He wanted to see which of them were actually threats and which weren't. He also wanted to see which of them were just hiding themselves and playing the long con, and which of them were truly wary of him. His interaction with the young man previously told him that just an outward showing of confidence wasn't enough to show strength. But that also meant that the vice versa was true as well. Tier level had suddenly become an absolutely useless metric for Lionel. Everyone here was either Tier 8 or Tier 9 of the 5th dimension. This was the case across the board. However, the strength level and variations among those who shared these tier levels was astronomical. At this point, Lionel almost felt that the lower tier a person was in this place, the stronger they were overall, something that was completely counterintuitive anywhere else. But this was the result you got when you gathered so many geniuses together. Lionel's own mother was still in the 6th dimension, just like the Luxnix family elders were, but wasn't the gap between them all still ridiculously enormous? And these were the very same 6th-dimensional elders that had wiped the floor with the elders of the Viola family just days earlier. In the beginning of Lionel's journey, he had had a nice and succinct power level calculator, but he had been forced to abandon it long ago. Now though, he almost felt he would have to bring it back in some form or fashion, or else he would really be going into all of these interactions blind. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, Lionel shook his head. He had already gone down that rabbit hole once before, and it was nothing more than a headache. There were simply too many variables to account for. It was better to rely on an instinctual feeling, ironically enough. What do you think, old man? How do you tell how much power a person wields? Isn't that simple? Just look at their souls. Lionel's expression became weird. There's a huge taboo around using internal sight to just probe people like that, and mine is no longer strong enough to just get away with it. Aren't you asking me to form enemies everywhere I went? It's not my fault you're unskilled. I've already given you the answer you wanted. Now leave me alone. I have to care for my real disciples. Lionel shook his head before completely ignoring the old man's request. Would that really work? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, obviously. People say eyes are the window to the soul, but the soul is literally the soul itself. It can't get any more important. Humans can't even sense and manipulate their own, so they have no ability to hide its secrets from those more skilled than them outside of using special treasures. Observing a soul won't give you a direct number you can translate to strength output, but reading the disposition of a soul will tell you a lot about a person. How much confidence they have, if it's false bravado or real, how much work they put in to earn such a thing, so on and so forth. A soul can't lie. Lionel laughed inwardly. You could have fooled me. Wise Star Order snorted and proceeded to ignore Lionel. The latter didn't have time to mind this, though, as he had made it to the very doors of the smithy he had been aiming for. Unsurprisingly, there were many who could be found here as well, but the atmosphere was even more tense. Despite there only being 3 hours until the trial began, many huddled near the counters of the smithy or corners all to their own, silently clutching something within their palms they didn't want to allow anyone else to see. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the opening of the door caused several to shoot glances toward Lionel, their gazes becoming more serious when they realized they couldn't recognize him at all. Chapter 1273. The more Lionel saw of this tense atmosphere, the more put off he was. He could even feel some of these reservations beginning to press upon himself as well. It was simply human nature to follow along with the crowd. But the oddity of it all was that a genius didn't usually fall into such things so easily. Lionel couldn't help but wonder what could have happened to such a large group of geniuses for the blades to dull to this extent. What had he missed in these last few months? The smithy had 3 main counters, none of which seemed to be markedly different from the others. Behind each of them, one stoic individual stood. All 3 were men and completely shirtless. Whenever someone came forward, an odd-looking spatial ring would be handed over. The man would then disappear behind the curtains to their back, only to return several minutes later with the very same odd spatial ring. The client in this case would hurriedly take the spatial ring away and rush out of the smithy with their heads lowered. The truth was that the only reason Lionel was able to tell this was a smithy as all was because he was quite sensitive to such things. Though the curtains were embedded with force arts that muffled sounds and blocked force, Lionel could practically smell it in the air. But that once again left him baffled. Do they really need weapons to this extent? Unless Lionel's gaze narrowed. With a thought, he flipped a palm and a weapon appeared within it. This wasn't a weapon that came out of the spear domain. Rather, it was one of the prototypes he had formed to prepare for practicing with his Scarlet Star force arts. Visit. For a better user experience, there wasn't anything special about the material other than the fact it was 6-dimensional. It was only a material of this level that could withstand destruction characteristics for a long enough period of time for Lionel to make use of it. For a long while nothing happened. Several flickering gazes landed on Lionel right then, but each of them turned away just as quickly as though they were scared that others would get the wrong idea. Even after several minutes passed, nothing happened. But Lionel's expression only became more serious. He reached forward with his other hand. With a slight bend of his wrists. Snap. Just like that, a perfectly primed and ready 6-dimensional metal snapped like a twig. Nothing seemed wrong with it initially, and yet it had already crumbled from the inside out. Those who had been silently observing Lionel snarled. It was obvious that he had figured it out without being told anything. Their efforts at keeping this matter a secret had clearly fallen through. Without hesitation, Lionel immediately transferred everything within his spatial ring into the segmented cube, and then brought the cube itself out. He didn't care about the gazes that fell onto it as he forced the segmented cube to change its form. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. The segmented cube was unable to become a spatial ring as it couldn't shrink past a certain point, but Lionel still managed to get it to become a finger sleeve that wrapped around his forefinger in miniature jigsaw pieces. Lionel gazed upon his original spatial ring, but unsurprisingly, with a light squeeze of his hand, it crumbled to dust. It seems that anarchic force isn't a joke. Will the necklace be fine? Lionel turned his attention to the necklace that held Y's star order, and then the necklace that held the golden-scaled koi fish. After a few checks, he realized that they still managed to maintain their structural integrity, at least for now. He would have to pay attention to this. The chain that held the golden-scaled koi fish up snapped under a pull from Lionel, before crumbling to dust. However, the ocean drop vial was perfectly fine. It seemed that only materials that had a certain standard would be able to survive in this environment. It was likely that even clothing wasn't safe. Lionel cast another glance and realized that everyone was wearing the same uniform. He hadn't thought about it much because this was an organization after all. Of course they would have the same uniforms. But if he allowed things to continue like this, he would end up naked very quickly. The anarchic force seems to work slower on normal fabrics because there's no force to feed off of. But it'll only be a matter of time before all our clothes crumble to ash. Lionel thought back to all those men who were still eyeing everyone he had brought, and suddenly understood that maybe their intentions were more perverted than sinister. Visit. For a better user experience seems it'll either need to find a method to gain uniforms, or at least build cabins, so that everyone can maintain their dignity. Lionel had a feeling that the Void Palace wouldn't be giving out these uniforms free of charge. When one thought about it, what better way would there be to make such a large population of geniuses feel so timid and reserved? These sadistic bastards. Lionel almost couldn't refrain from laughing. They wanted to cut everyone down a peg, so they stripped them of their clothing and made them fight for scraps. Lionel had been able to figure out the problem quickly, but what about the others? There had probably been a time here where everyone was forced to use rocks and planks of wood to cover their decency. How could you continue to be arrogant, prideful and haughty under such circumstances? It was even worse that Lionel and the others were only given 3 hours. At this pace, their clothes would be nothing more than ash by the time the true selection started. And then what? They were meant to participate naked? Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's amused gaze flickered with a cold light. He didn't actually care about being naked or not, but for some reason, this still made him angry. At the village entrance, a certain little mink's long whiskers twitched, taking an even more defensive stance around Aina as he freely interpreted Lionel's thoughts. Chapter 1274. Lionel closed his eyes, taking a small breath. When he opened them once more, he had regained his focus. He was at least 90% certain now that one of the main tasks he had to accomplish in Village 0012 was to earn a uniform. But he not only had to do this for himself, but also another more than dozen individuals. However, if there was one hidden pitfall, Lionel would be foolish to believe that there wouldn't be another, especially after spending so much time with Wise Star Order. With a sharp eye, Lionel proceeded to visit every shop. Soon, he found out just how correct he was. There were pitfalls to be found in every one of them. The second and most obvious issue was water and food in general. The food stores were clearly the only way to guarantee healthy sources of nutrition. Much the same way geniuses brought resources to the smithy in exchange for what Lionel assumed was clothing or weapons, so too did they bring resources to the storefronts in exchange for what Lionel assumed was food and water. Then there were the herb shops. This store, in Lionel's estimation, was probably a bit different. It wasn't just about nutrition or clothing. It was about finding a path to strengthen yourself and slow the deterioration of your strength. Spending such a long time in this environment ate away at not only one's psyche, but also, in a much more literal sense, one's force. The process was once more unchanged. A secret exchange between worker and disciple followed by a dash away by the latter. Finally, there was the final storefront, the healer. By the time Lionel got here, there was a familiar young man barely holding himself together as he dragged himself in. But even outside of him, the line here was even longer than all the other lines combined. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel had gotten quite used to seeing gruesome injuries, but this was truly on another level entirely. Promising youths had entire arms and legs lost, some had their guts spilling out of their stomachs, and Lionel even saw one with a bite taken out of their skull, just barely sparing the tender flesh of their now exposed brain. When Lionel was finished, he realized a few things. First, there was nothing on the outside of these buildings that described what their function was. There were no signs, no exchange rates, no friendly smile waiting to explain nothing. Lionel realized that the only reason he had been able to tell what purpose these buildings served was by observing, process of elimination and deduction. It was something that all humans could do, but something he most definitely did on a far higher level than most. Of course, it was also a great help that everyone else had already figured these things out in his stead. Even if he wasn't even a tenth as intelligent, he would be able to guess. The second thing he realized was that all of these matters were practically the bare minimum an organization should provide. A treasury, health, food, and healing. If an organization couldn't provide these things, then there was really no need for its existence. And yet, it was precisely these foundational things that the Void Palace forced them all to scratch and claw for. Lionel could easily imagine a scene where these geniuses came to this place, feeling high and mighty about their acceptance into the human domain's greatest power, only to get slapped in the face repeatedly by a cruel reality. They didn't end up being treated like kings and queens like they hoped. Instead, they were stripped of their clothing, forced to find that the treasures and resources they had brought with them to flaunt their wealth was useless, and then humiliated to the point they could only scurry around like rats and mice in the place they should have held their heads up the highest. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel could even imagine situations where food they had brought was poisoned by the anarchic force, their water becoming laced with impurities that forced them to rush to these healers, only for them to come to the understanding that nothing in this place was free. They had probably begged and pleaded, some of them had probably even thrown a fit and become enraged, only to realize that the store workers were behemoths with strength capable of crushing them all with nothing more than a single finger. A dream simulation of what must have happened formulated in Lionel's mind, becoming clearer and clearer until it all snapped into place, filling him with understanding. So what do I do about it? Lionel's mind flashed. He already deduced the answer. With a spin of his heel, his body flashed, appearing to the outskirts of the village on the direct opposing side of where he had entered. While the front of the village had nothing, the back was walled off by a wall of thick black logs connected as one. There were no doorways or gates, something that left Lionel confused for a moment, until he spotted a poor soul leaping over from the other side and falling nearly 100 meters in a frantic getaway. Despite their best efforts, a tendril of what looked like a beast Lionel had simply never seen before lashed out, slapping against the leg of the falling victim before they could get all the way over. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. A cry of pain resounded as the individual found their leg bursting into a misty rain of crimson. Their body spiraled off to the side, causing their fall to accelerate at a downward angle. Bang! 100-meter fall in a 7th-dimensional world was no joke, especially for a 5th-dimensional existence, no matter how much of a genius you were. Just from his vantage point, Lionel could tell that the young man had broken practically every bone in his body just now. I guess that answers where they're all going to get hurt. Lionel looked up. Just scaling this 100-meter wall of logs was a feat after all. They were planted vertically, not horizontally. To have to do so while being chased by something that could kill you with a single slap. Well, Lionel had a feeling that there were a ton of corpses on the other side of this wall. No time to waste. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel activated the second awakening of his Snowy Star Owl lineage factor's speed branch. A road of white gold appeared beneath his feet. With a step, he shot into the skies with a deft control, his toes stamping down hard on the log wall and jetting himself upward. Soon he vanished over its height. Chapter 1275. He left. Already? Is he an idiot? They only have 3 hours left, what choice did he have? A laughing voice responded. The location was Village 0012 within a cabin built much larger than most of the others around it. Though the craftsmanship was shoddy, it was clear that the original cabin had been built much smaller before its owner grew more confident and began to put in additional add-ons. There's no use in rushing if you're just going off to your death. At this point, we might as well not even waste our time. He'll get himself killed. I don't know how he accustomed himself to the anarchic force so quickly, but the concentration here and the concentration in the forest are on 2 completely different levels. Within the cabin, 2 young men sat. They seemed like oddly matched mirror images of one another. The look might have been absolutely perfect had it not been for the fact they wore the exact same uniform everyone else did. One had a head of white hair and black eyes while the other had a head of black hair and white eyes. The former had skin as dark as night while the latter had skin as bright as day. However, maybe the most interesting thing about them was that their features were identical down to the individual strands of hair on their head, and up to the slight slant of their smiles. These 2 were from a very prominent family of the 7th dimension, the Libra family. If this family were to be put on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 would be the weakest families of the 7th dimension, and 10 would be the strongest, they would likely fall between 7 and 8. Simply put, having disciples enter the Void Palace wasn't rare for them in the slightest, and this was especially so with a pair like these 2. The white-haired and dark-skinned brother, Juan. The black-haired and light-skinned brother, Droit. The latest _AP_SOTIs are on the website. The two had obviously planned to do something to Lionel, if for nothing other than to whittle down the competition a bit more. However, it was also clear that they felt that Lionel was unworthy of the emphasis they were going to give him, judging by his choices alone. The truth was that the only ones still scrambling around and trying to drudge up void points now were those who were at the bottom of the totem pole to begin with. Those who were confident in themselves were resting and waiting for the 3-hour limit to be completed. Knowing that, if Lionel wasn't a threat, why would they waste their time risking their peak condition for the coming true selection? It was best if they saved their resources and strength. At that moment, though, an unexpected knock came from the door. The two brothers met each other's gaze before putting up their guards. Just because they didn't see Lionel as a threat, didn't mean that there would be other threats to watch out for. When they finally did open the door, though, the person they found was Orinik. And when they heard what he had to say, the sly and slanted smiles of the two brothers only deepened. Lionel had already deduced what he had to do. As annoying as Asena was, she had still managed to leave him behind a clue. Build your own cabin. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the obvious question to ask to such a task was how. Obviously, this how didn't refer to the logistics of the actual matter, but rather in the more auxiliary matters. For example, where would he build it? Was anywhere fine? And then, the most important of the auxiliary questions, where would he find the wood to do so? Lionel didn't know for certain, but he had an educated guess as to two places. The first was the most obvious, and that was beyond the wall of black logs. The second was more subtle but still required going beyond the walls regardless, and that was to exchange void points for the wood he needed. As Lionel fell from the top of the walls, he realized that his conjectures were correct. Or at the very least, the first was. The first thing he saw was a vast cloud of fog. As far as the eye could see, this fog covered everything. The second thing Lionel saw were the treetops and tree canopies that just barely managed to peek out above the dome of fog. The trees closer to the village were much smaller than the 100-meter-tall longs used to construct the walls, but those further only became taller and taller to the point they rivaled mountains all to their own. These trees, though, were all made of greatly resistant materials, and were likely the very wood that made up so many of the cabins. With a whoosh, Lionel shot through the dome of fog, leaving behind a small hole that was quickly enveloped from all sides. But the moment he did so, his pupils constricted. Right then, Lionel's clothing burst into a cloud of ash. The concentration of anarchic force was at least double here, and though that still left it in the parts per several billion range, it was more than enough to leave Lionel streaking naked in the nude. Visit. For a better _user experience, with a heavy stomp, Lionel landed on the ground below, his knees instantly suffering from a severe jolt. The ground gave him no leeway whatsoever, causing all the shock to transfer up his bones. If it wasn't for the sturdiness of his body, he would have probably suffered a fracture or two. Have to adjust to this world. Should have used a movement technique to slow myself down. Lionel made a mental note and calculated everything in his mind. After a moment, he felt he understood his limits, at least in this form. Lionel took a step forward after the jolt of shock waned, and pressed a palm to the nearest tree. That creature that had attacked earlier was likely still close by, so he didn't want to stay in a single spot for too long. But he needed to understand this before he moved on. This tree is. Lionel understood at that point that he was definitely correct. There had to be another method to trade for this wood. Let alone the difficulty in cutting a tree like this down. Just the idea of trying to hoist it over the 100-meter-tall wall was a daunting task even for him. At that moment, Lionel's gaze suddenly narrowed. It's coming, it's already locked onto me. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1276. Lionel gaze sharpened, his eyes quickly scanning the region. In this dense fog, his internal sight could only stretch out about 5 meters, which was barely beyond his line of sight, which was about 2 meters in this environment. The trouble was that thought it was theoretically better than relying on his eyes, the impact on his stamina was too great. Under normal circumstances, he could continuously use his internal sight passively without much issue. But in this world, not only had a seventh-dimensional pressure restricted his range to an extreme, but the anarchic force also ate away at him rapidly. The only reason Lionel was able to sense the creature was because his instincts had called out to him. He could feel a slimy and slippery internal sight latching onto his body. In fact, he could even read some of the creature's emotions. There was nothing but an endless thirst and hunger. It wanted nothing more than to eat and satiate itself. The feeling was so overwhelming that it leaked into its internal sight, even beginning to affect Lionel's own psyche somewhat. In a moment of distraction, a wild tendril appeared to Lionel's side, whipping down with a force that dispersed the fog for several meters. Lionel regained his bearing, jumping back. The tendril slammed against the ground heavily. After seeing what had happened to that youth's leg earlier, Lionel was certain that the ground would shatter and erupt out in all directions with countless spiderweb-like cracks, but the reality was very much different. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. The tendril was sent rebounding backward, a cry that sounded somewhat like a pained shout resonating through the forest. Lionel got another wake-up call about just how sturdy the world around him was. That same tendril had blasted a person's leg into a bloody mess seconds ago, but it couldn't even cause a crack in the ground. The disparity was glaring. Lionel didn't get much of a chance to think about this, though, as the tendril suddenly gained several companions. One line of black became 6, snaking toward Lionel with blinding speed that left after images in the air. The wind refused to give way, giving each tendril a chorus of wind pressure that assaulted Lionel long before the attack itself landed. Don't have time to play around here. With a tap of his foot, Lionel activated the second awakening of his speed branch once again, slipping by the first 2 tendrils and drawing closer toward the source. The tendrils reacted quickly, one portion sweeping for Lionel's knees, and the other for his neck. Lionel jumped into the air, his body flipping horizontally and slipping out the combined high and low attack. The instant he felt his feet hit earth once more, he exploded forward. Visit. For a better user experience in that moment, Lionel's force surged throughout his body, a faint red gold pulsing beneath his bronze skin. The feeling was so soothing and relaxing, but the resulting speed was only all the more exaggerated. As though Lionel's blood and force had only just finally circulated properly for the first time, the wind before him burst, shattering as he leapt across the final distance. What Lionel saw when he closed in was quite surprising. It looked like nothing more than a normal wolf. It had gruff gray fur and a sharp snout, not to mention a pair of yellow eyes that reflected something half carnal and half intelligent. However, what felt like a normal beast very quickly became a horror story. With another look, Lionel spotted several pulsing veins of black hidden beneath the wolf's tough exterior fur, something that only just barely caught his attention due to the light reflected in its yellow eyes. To make matters worse, its belly was the worst of it. The stomach of the wolf had burst open, revealing what looked like leaking intestines. Yet, instead of that, what they were instead were the very origin of the tendrils that had been attacking Lionel. It was a sight grotesque beyond words, and it almost made Lionel freeze completely. If it was an odd ability mutation, Lionel could barely accept it. But something told Lionel that this mutation had almost nothing to do with such a thing at all. Whatever had happened to this wolf had likely occurred to the environment around it. The real question was how. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, were all the beasts here like this? Was it because they had ingested something? Or was this simply what happened when you spent too long in this environment? Or was it a different unknown Lionel couldn't even begin to speculate on? Despite all these thoughts running through Lionel's brain, his steps only faltered for a moment before they accelerated once again. He entered the close range, the tendrils that surrounded him from all sides being rendered useless for the immediate while. The wolf was only 1.5 meters tall, and it seemed to have lost much of its agility thanks to its new status. Lionel took full advantage, his spear appearing in his hands and piercing forward. A flicker of gold touched its blade, his spear force having seemingly evolved once more. PCHU. The head of the wolf was precisely split in two. In fact, The range of Lionel's spear was so pure that the force sliced through its entire body, even after Lionel came to a grinding halt, bisecting the beast entirely. Lionel immediately checked his spear. If even his spear domain spears were affected, it would be a problem. The spear domain heirloom could probably fix them before they crumbled to ash, but it would be troublesome in a long, drawn-out battle to have to constantly switch between spears. Surprisingly, though, Lionel found that his quasi-silver spear was doing just fine, something that made him raise an eyebrow. Lionel was about to turn his back when his heart suddenly twitched. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, he shot backward explosively as the belly of the beast erupted. A violent surge of tendrils that looked like a wall of tentacles shooting toward him. Chapter 1277. Lionel's expression turned cold. He thought of many possibilities, most of which centered around a parasitic organism of some sort. Regardless, he would probably have to narrow down exactly what was going on here later. But first suring. Lionel's spear shifted to one hand as he fell backward and activated. In the next moment, his arm's speed flourished, leaving nothing but a blur in the air as it crisscrossed through the dispersing fog. 5 lines were drawn in quick succession, forming the image of a star that shot forward. The wall of tendrils was minced to pieces, sliced apart until nothing but half-dead wiggling worms of black danced about the forest floor. Lionel's retreat slowed, his mind still on full alert. That technique was technically a sword technique, and he could only execute it with the proper nimbleness if he used a single hand, but it had most definitely done the job. When he had the time, he had to see if the bronze tablet had spear techniques within it that he could use. But for now this would have to do. After a few moments, Lionel felt confident in the fact there wasn't a next attack coming. The increase to his spear force's strength was far beyond his expectations, but this was definitely a good thing. It felt like his was infinitesimally close to level 3 despite only having recently grasped level 2. Lionel leapt forward, dancing around to avoid touching the tendrils, and landing by the corpse of the wolf. He inspected everything from head to toe, but the conclusions he came to were each more baffling than the last. Firstly, this wolf was only at the Tier 1 level of the 5th dimension. The fact it had such strength at such a low level made Lionel several points more serious. It had looked easy for him to defeat, and it was, but when framed to the power level of this wolf, Lionel could be said to have struggled. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience. Secondly, the tendrils didn't really seem to be a parasite, it and the wolf were one entity. No matter how much Lionel looked, he couldn't find a separation between the two. That last attack must have just been a final desperate attempt by the wolf to feed itself, but it only quickened its death. And that led to the third shocking realization. Even after bisecting the wolf in two, it had actually not died. In fact, if Lionel was correct, that last burst attack did more to push it toward death than his spear strike had. What a weird beast. Hey old man, you probably know something about this, right? Asking me? You know this is cheating, right? Nonsense. This is called using the resources you have at hand. They didn't come and take the segmented cube away from me even though it can survive in this environment, so clearly there are some not-so-fair rules at play here. Whatever helps you sleep at night, criminal. These are cursed beasts. They're very common in regions with dense anarchic force. Why's that? I thought anarchic force swallowed things. How could it lead to such mutations? The main issue stems from how it reacts with materials and the environment. Within a certain threshold, anarchic force can be resisted. That's why you're not all dead just yet. However, at these concentrations, all sorts of imbalances of force can be created. When you take a higher dimensional herb with fantastical abilities, and you strip away just a portion of the forces that allow it to create those magical effects, then those magical effects can mutate into something completely different. It can make a medicinal herb poisonous, it could make a strengthening herb give you an extra limb, it could even do the opposite sometimes and make a bad thing good. The latest _AP_SODIes are on website. Beasts tend to strengthen themselves by feeding off nature, so they'll suffer from this far more than humans would. It takes expert craftsmen to be able to use materials infected by anarchic force to produce wanted results. Lionel nodded, thinking back to the storefronts of Village 0012. These matters were definitely related. Those weren't just workers, they were skilled crafters, all specialized in working around anarchic force. However, this isn't the sole reason for these mutations. The way beasts strengthen themselves is different from how humans do so. They rely much more on their instincts, and the balance of force in their environment is very important. In a lot of ways, they're like the herbs they consume, relying on very precise measurements of force that anarchic force can easily throw off. With enough time, most end up killing themselves. But those that survive will be far deviated from the creatures they started off as in. They'll also tend to be far more powerful as well. Lionel's brows shot up. Little Black Star. You probably don't have to worry about that little mink. I don't know how you did it, but it's been evolved with a large amount of void beast blood, and has even experienced a perfect integration. There are only 2 beasts to have ever existed that could be considered to be immune to anarchic force. And one of them is the void beast. What's the other? Lionel asked curiously. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience-wise, Star Order didn't answer immediately, but ended up shaking his head. Aren't you on a time crunch, brat? Why are you standing here asking about irrelevant things far above your pay grade? Those words seemed to jolt Lionel awake. For once the old man was right. He dashed forward, but came to a grinding halt again after hearing the old man speak once more. Are you an idiot? Why are you leaving the corpse behind? I'm fairly certain this is one of the many materials you can trade in. You can trade that in. Lionel felt his stomach lurch. What other kind of food do you think you're going to find here? Lionel grit his teeth, realizing that the old man was probably right. He really wanted to go and find something more appetizing, but on such a time crunch, he couldn't afford to be so picky. After a moment, he had taken the corpse into a snow globe and moved deeper into the forest. Soon though he spotted something very familiar. Visit. For a better user experience on an oddly shaped plant just ahead, numerous oddly shaped ring objects hung upon it like ornaments. Lionel recognized them immediately. These oddly shaped rings were the very same weird spatial rings he had seen everyone using back at the village. For some reason, though, the air felt particularly dangerous in this region. The pull of spatial force was especially strong, as though one wrong step could tear him to pieces. Chapter 1278. So this is where their spatial rings are coming from. How fascinating. I've never come across something like this. To the people of Earth, taking inspiration from nature wasn't something new. There were countless examples of engineers using evolutionary traits of animals and plants in their inventions. But it seemed that things might not be so different in the wider dimensional verse. Lionel wasn't sure what came first between this mysterious bush and spatial rings, but he wouldn't be surprised if the latter required inspiration from the former. Forming a spatial ring was such a complex process, and one of the rare crafts where affinity for the element was almost intrinsically important, so the deduction made sense. This bush is very dangerous though. To warp space in a 7th-dimensional world is no joking matter. It's hard to tell if ITLL just shift me through some distance, or if ITLL tear my body apart. Even the former could be dangerous if it was pulling different parts of my body at different rates. Lionel observed the bush for a moment before stepping forward. His hips swiveled to the side and his body pushed through as though he was pressed up against 2 walls. He pulled through, hopping onto one leg and ducking his head in the next moment. If others were observing him, he would look as though he was doing some sort of ridiculous ritualistic dance. However, those with a sharp eye for spatial fluctuations would see something very different. Something much more akin to a young man walking a tightrope between life and death. And yet, Lionel didn't seem to be flustered in the slightest. After observing the bush for some time, Lionel realized that there were no sudden changes related to this plant. Every influence on space was like a steady flow of water, and any obstructions and snap decisions could be observed. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience soon. Lionel was within arm's reach of the bush, But he didn't hurry to pick at any of the odd spatial ring constructs. Instead, he continued to flicker around the bush, dodging the changes and fluctuations in space. If I'm correct, I could probably gain a nice amount of merit trading in all the spatial rings of this bush. But judging by this, if I take one, the bush will retaliate. All things considered, making it this close to the bush wasn't much of an issue for Lionel. After all, his current spatial affinity stacked up well to most things within the sixth dimension thanks to the evolution, or he had fused his divine armor with. However, this bush was clearly far beyond his capabilities. Though Lionel hadn't tested it in this world, he could probably only teleport a meter or two at most, and he wouldn't even be surprised if it was just half a meter. But this bush had a passive area of effect of at least 10 meters, and this was obviously not its full effort. Any plant or living thing had an innate instinct to protect itself. Obviously, a bush wouldn't have the intelligence of beasts or humans, and its thoughts and senses wouldn't be as flexible. So it had still managed to allow Lionel to get this close. But it would be a different matter entirely if Lionel actually plucked a part of it away. While Lionel was confident in taking one as most other people had, he would have to retreat immediately. If he got greedy and tried to take a second, he would be putting his own life at risk. However, Lionel had also deduced something else in the moments he observed the bush. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Firstly, these spatial rings were an integral part of how business was done in the Void Palace. There wasn't a single transaction he witnessed that didn't involve at least one of them. Secondly, after testing it, Lionel realized that even seventh-dimensional spatial rings stood no chance in this environment. From the treasure trove of Wise Star Order, there were 3 spatial devices of that caliber. He had tested his theory on the weakest of them with the smallest space, and watched it almost crumble beneath his eyes. This meant that there was a good chance that unless you had a treasure on the level of the segmented cube, these spatial devices would be all you could use in this place. Thirdly, one could never have enough spatial devices. It was too easy to run out of space, and if it wasn't for the fact he had the segmented cube, Lionel would carry around at least 4 or 5 like everyone else did. And fourthly, and maybe one of the more important points, Lionel could tell that the spaces within most of these natural space rings were incredibly small. This branch is divided into 3 main categories, with each surpassing tier, the spatial fluctuations around them only grows. The weakest rings only have a 1 cubic meter space. The middle tier only have an 8 cubic meter space. The largest only have a 27 cubic meter space. If experience hadn't told Lionel that he should hide the segmented cube previously, this most definitely did. In a place where spatial devices were so greatly restricted, Lionel, who had almost unlimited space, would be seen as a prime target. Visit. For a better user experience. When Lionel thought of this, he chuckled. Why was he even wasting his time thinking about this? Keeping a low profile, was that even possible anymore? By the time he returned to Village 0012, he was certain that he would have already become public enemy number 1. If I'm going to be a villain for now, I might as well profit. Lionel's gaze turned a frightening shade of cold, his palm flipping over to reveal his trident spear. In the moment, his muscles bulged and veins coursed all throughout his body. In the next instant, he became nothing more than a blur, moving about so quickly that booms of compressed air ricocheted into the surroundings. Every place he passed by, another sharp line would be cut into the ground before it quickly froze. A radiant foggy blue frost wafting from the ground. Lionel's figure flickered, and came to a grinding halt outside the range of the spatial bush. I guess in the Void Palace, it'll be a warrior second, and a force crafter first. Visit. For a better user experience. Lionel grinned. Bang. Spatial rings began to rain from the skies, falling into a neat pile before Lionel. Chapter 1279. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:28 and 19 seconds p.m. Chapter 1279. Weird shift. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1279. Weird shift. Lionel focused entirely on hunting the spatial bushes, or what he soon learned were called spatial bristle bushes. Spatial bristle bushes were known for their thorn-like protrusions forming bony structures around its tender leaves and branches. These bony structures would form into tight circles enveloped by sharp spikes. When connected to the spatial bristle bush, these spikes would be very sharp, slicing through flesh as though it was nothing more than butter. In addition, when the bush sensed danger, these invisible spikes would lengthen, skewering everything in its surroundings. Once the defenses of the spatial bristle bush were activated, it would take several days to weeks for it to calm. In fact, as Lionel rushed around, many of the bushes he came across he had no choice but to leave be and abandon because they had already been harassed once, making it more difficult for him to do what he needed to do. However, this didn't deter Lionel very much. These bushes weren't very rare, and due to his spatial affinity, he could sense them from further away than his internal sight and eyes could. Just rushing around for a few hours, Lionel found 4 bushes in a relaxed state, though he was obstructed by almost 10 that were very much not relaxed. If others saw what Lionel was doing, they would be shocked. Most had to scratch and claw for just a single spatial device, but Lionel had almost 150 now, each of various degrees of rarity. However, to Lionel, his process was quite simple, especially with the increase to computational ability. The first thing he had done was form an artistic conception around the spatial bristle bush, using Camelot's magic system. This sort of formation was a step deeper than even a dream sculpt would be as it dove into the very foundation of the bush's being. Once this construct was finished, Lionel had a practically infallible representation of how the bush would read and react in any sort of situation. With this in mind, he formed a perfect counter, relying on his dark ice divine armor to draw the force art around it. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Lionel was very much used to using clashing concepts of space to get what he wanted. Back when he fought the Puppet Master, he had used the teleportation formations of White City and Kefir City. By using the push and pull effect of both teleportation formations working against and with one another, he had been able to freeze the region between the two cities, and even kept White City suspended in the air long enough for him to stroll out as he pleased. Lionel had accomplished that feat with less spatial affinity, less experience and far less intelligence and computational ability than he had now, not to mention all while fighting an existence that was far beyond himself in strength. So what could he accomplish now? The answer was quite simple: a lot more. Lionel used the strength of the spatial bristle bush against itself. His own spatial affinity was far less than that of the bush, so he couldn't possibly expect to do anything outstanding. But what he could do was slow it down just a little bit. In its lulled state, the bushes were in enough of a calm that Lionel's petty tricks worked on it. Using a force art, he slowed the movement of space around the bush just to the point where it practically froze over, causing cracks of glass to appear in the air. The bush would immediately recognize this as a threat to its safety, but due to the fact it was reacting on instinct and not intelligence, it wouldn't realize that it was actually pushing and pulling against itself. This would set off an enormous chain reaction that would overextend the spatial bristle bush, causing its more fragile leaves and branches to be torn apart by its own strength. In an irony of all ironies, the only part of it that would survive the destruction were the only parts of its design to be its defenses in the first place: the spatial bristles. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelbin.com to experience faster update speed without its core and essentially losing its life. The spatial bristles would become harmless, looking like bone shards fashioned into makeshift rings, like some sort of arts and crafts project result. Along the way, Lionel ran into many more beasts. But as he hadn't traveled very far into the forest, they remained relatively weak and easy to handle. After just 2 hours, he returned to the wall of black logs, exhaling an even breath. 320 spatial bristle rings. This should be enough to trade for what I need. Lionel didn't like the idea of relying on just a single plan though. He had invested 2 hours into this and could have invested more, but putting your eggs in one basket was foolhardy no matter how certain he was. Plus, he was sure there would be more opportunities to exploit those bushes in the future. Lionel once again placed a palm on the trees that lined the outer reaches of the forest. The ones here were the shortest and weakest of them all. If one wanted to cut any of them down, this would definitely be the best choice. There were only two options Lionel thought he had here. One was to use something sharper than this tree could withstand. Two was to rely on his Scarlet Star Force. The issue was that he didn't know if either was viable. First, he didn't have a weapon sharp enough. Even if he took the risk to claim a quasi-gold peak spear right now, it probably still wouldn't be enough alone. And second, if he was only planning on using a passive comprehension of destruction, it wouldn't nearly be enough either, and he had no intention of injuring himself so severely by using it actively. It seems like the only option is a combination of both. There's an hour left. Let's see how far these spatial bristle rings get me first. Lionel's figure flickered, a road of white gold appearing beneath his feet as he shot into the skies, running up the side of the black log. When he got to the other side, though landing much more softly after learning his lesson, he immediately felt the weird shift in the atmosphere. Chapter 1280. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:28 and 16 seconds p.m. Chapter 1280. Next LN line: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1280. Next LN line: Lionel could easily feel the gazes on him. There weren't many who were still leaping the black log wall at this point, and it could even be said that he was the only one. It was far too easy to spot him. The moment he landed on the ground, he could feel several internal sights surge toward him, causing his brow to raise. These people were quite brazen. He had gone out of his way not to antagonize anyone with his own internal sight, but it was clear they had no intention of showing him the same courtesy. Piss off. Bang. A muffled and invisible surge whipped about the surroundings. Lionel manipulated his internal sight with the artistic conception of the imploded spatial bristle bush, and laced it with concepts of destruction. The instant the wall of surging internal sights entered his range, they coiled back reflexively, a pained sort of retreat one would expect from touching a stove that was too hot ensuing. Lionel swept a gaze through the village, his eyes suffused with a hardly hidden coldness. The perpetrators were nowhere to be found, but this was to be expected. They probably thought they didn't even have to step outside their cabins in order to probe him. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Still, if it had been just a normal, casual prod, Lionel wouldn't have cared so much. However, there was a very intentional sort of brazenness to it. Ever since Wise Star Order had mentioned how good the soul was at revealing things the eyes otherwise couldn't, Lionel had been paying more attention to these things. It was also much easier for him to do so considering the fact that he had managed to sense and awaken his own soul in a sense thanks to the spirituals. When he had fought with the cursed wolf, he had been able to sense its overwhelming hunger. In fact, every cursed beast he had come across seemed to have a certain emotion amplified to an extreme degree as well. And now, when faced with all of those internal sights, he had grasped their emotions as well. Disdain, disregard, contempt, indifference. There was even some righteous indignation and real anger mixed in. Lionel already had a few guesses as to why that was, but that didn't mean he would just allow people to trample all over him because they felt like it. If he had allowed them to probe him, not only would he come off weak, but it would also reveal his gains from the last 2 hours. He had no intention of doing anything of the sort. He began to walk forward, his expression not giving anything away. With a thought, he reached out to Little Blackstar, and saw that the situation over there was basically the same. But it also seemed that their clothing wouldn't hold out for much longer either. The current Lionel had used some of the tailoring skills he had learned from his father's training program to weave together a beast skin skirt for himself. The beasts had survived just fine in this region, so their fur and coats were greatly resistant as well. He looked out of place walking through the village like this, as anyone who could kill and defeat the beasts out there had long since traded for their own uniforms, but he didn't care. The first thing Lionel did was head to one of the storefronts. This place sold both beast meat and doubled as tailoring shop, likely because the materials that made up their uniforms came from the beast skins to begin with. It was also possible that they relied on some herbs as well, But Lionel didn't really care about what the process was. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelbin.com to experience faster update speed. He found himself a place in line and fell into silence. Several gazes shifted toward him, but as usual, the store was most silent aside from shuffling and the occasional whisper. Everyone in this village seemed to take their words as golden, and even the exchanges happened in silence. It could only be said that the Void Palace did almost too good of a job in knocking these geniuses down a peg. Lionel remembered reading in a work of fiction that most armies worked this way, whittling down one's sense of individuality and sense of self until all you dared to do was obediently follow orders. He had always thought that this was an exaggeration and that no good army could possibly be raised that way. In his mind, the foundation of an army was a good leader and cool uniforms. But there was clearly no leader here, and even the uniforms they as rookies were left with were nowhere near as amazing as the ones those sector-ranked disciples had worn. Instead, everyone looked like they were walking around in shirt and pants little better than rags. If you removed context and told Lionel that this was a slave encampment, he would believe it. The line continued to move slowly. Despite Lionel believing that the crafters were actually working quite quickly, it still took a minute or two per person. By the time it was finally Lionel's turn, a little over 10 minutes had passed, leaving him with 50 until his deadline. Though everyone else hadn't spoken, Lionel didn't really have much of a choice but to speak. After all, he still didn't know anything about the exchange rates or what he could even trade for here. That said, he was still fairly confident that he had enough to get what he needed, especially after seeing the poverty of everyone else. "Hello, I have some resources to exchange. Might I know of what the rates are?" Lionel smiled lightly, looking toward the young lady behind the counter. She looked like she was in her mid-20s and was only tall enough to come up to Lionel's chest. Her hair was done up in a serious ponytail without a single strand out of place, and she had piercing gray eyes that met Lionel's own indifferently. Lionel's smile couldn't help but fade a bit when he realized the young woman didn't answer him. She looked toward him for only a moment more before looking past him entirely, her gaze landing on the person to Lionel's back. Obviously, she was asking for the next in line. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1281. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:28 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 1281. Leash. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1281. Leash. Lionel's gaze only narrowed for a moment, but the dangerous feeling that gripped his neck was near instantaneous. He hadn't even moved or said anything, but it was as though the warning was already prepared. No, it was more like someone was hoping and praying that he would do something, as though this was exactly the sort of moment they were waiting for. Lionel was under no illusions that he could already defeat a Void Palace disciple. He wasn't enough of a fool to have lost his head in such a way. At the same time, he also didn't believe that this young woman didn't have an answer for him. She wasn't answering because she didn't feel like it. Or, more accurately, she wasn't answering because she didn't want to. That same air of disdain and disregard was carried with that dangerous feeling around his neck. The gap between himself and this woman was large enough that Lionel knew he wouldn't even last a few exchanges, but that only made the feeling all the more potent. These crafters hadn't had much respect for the rookies in this village to begin with. This was probably just an easy way for them to accumulate void points. But for whatever reason, they were especially disdainful of Lionel. Lionel himself, though, didn't flinch or retreat. In fact, his smile only completely faded away, a certain lofty indifference coloring his irises as he looked down toward the woman before him. He didn't say a word, he only seemed to memorize this individual's face before his gaze shifted toward the other two store clerks, but neither of them even looked his way. It was as though these matters didn't have the slightest thing to do with them. It all summed up to one thought. He had wasted 10 precious minutes. Lionel turned and left the store without a word. The next place he went to was the smithy. If he couldn't secure uniforms, he had to, at the very least, try and secure weapons for everyone. That would be their true lives' blood in this place. Lionel had been out there already. Even if you could do so, Defeating those beasts with nothing more than your hands was too dangerous. The contamination of anarchic force would increase by several orders of magnitude, and the result could be catastrophic. Lionel had made such a mistake before when a hint of a creature's blood touched his skin, and his situation could have turned for the worst if it wasn't for the fact he had cleansing waters with him. In such an environment, without a weapon that could actually survive in this land, you would be finished. But, once again he wasted 10 minutes. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. The gaze of one of the burly and shirtless store clerks met his own. However, instead of remaining silent like the young woman had, his mouth actually opened to speak. Crawl out of my shop while you still have legs to do so. Lionel's irises flickered with crimson, a sudden heat searing to life above his right hip. The temperature of the smithy rose just the slightest measure, but it was an uncomfortable sort of heat, the kind that only occurred when the air was particularly moist, and every rising degree latched onto your skin and suffocated your sweat glands. In this sort of heat, even breathing felt uncomfortable, and every inch of clothing felt unbearable. Lionel was usually quite good at controlling his temper, at least when it was related to matters of himself. So long as such things didn't include his family and friends, biding his time and striking back in the most lethal of ways only when the moment was right was his status quo. But for some reason he found it especially hard to do this now. He had no idea how he made it out of that shop without letting his rage burn. This might have sounded like a throwaway line or an exaggeration, but it was actually the raw truth. Lionel dulled his senses to an extreme using dream sense, smothering the rolling flames in his chest, turned on his heel, and walked out without a word. Others might have taken this sort of opportunity to sneer, but such individuals wouldn't have noticed the vacant look in his eyes, almost as though he was no longer even in control of his own body. The next store Lionel visited sold food and water. Those in higher dimensions could usually spend longer than those in lower dimensions without food, and this was thanks to force. It was the control over these mysterious energies they had that could make up for a whole host of things, including food and sleep. However, in an environment that fought back against you like this one, force couldn't be casually diverted to the upkeep of the body. It was too focused on keeping you alive under the assault of the poison in the air. Lionel had eaten not long ago, and he could already feel that he would maybe last a day more before hunger set in once again. Unfortunately, it was yet another 10 minutes wasted. As though a glutton for punishment, Lionel still chose to go to the final store. This wasn't because he was a fool. Rather, he owed it to the others to at least check. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. This final storefront was for medicine and healthcare. This was the only place most who got infected and gained severe injuries could go. And it was also the only place that sold herbs and pills that could counter anarchic force, while being cut off from all the others could still leave one room for survival if they were resourceful and careful enough, not to mention willing to weather the humiliation of being without clothes. Being cut off from this one was akin to sentencing a person to death. Being rejected from this place was akin to these people saying they wanted him dead. 20 minutes he waited. 20 minutes he waited to confirm this truth. The line for this place was the longest of them all, and for good reason at that. When Lionel made it to the front of the line, he found a woman with green hair and irises that fused into the whites of her eyes. It was clear that she was blind, or at least she appeared to be so. But her demeanor was no less momentous than all the other disciples. Leave. Those were the simple words she spoke without the slightest hint of change in her expression. By this point, Lionel was no longer using dream sense. The corners of his lips angled downward and his lips pursed as he nodded his head. His entire expression seemed to read, "Okay, no problem." Lionel turned around for the fourth time and stood in the middle of the village square. He closed his eyes and took a slight breath. 10 minutes. That was all that was left of the hour he had had remaining when he returned. His hands slid into his pockets, his head tilting up to the skies as his eyes remained closed. He couldn't seem to sense the glances of satisfaction that landed on him in the slightest. In the skies, Cornelius felt another headache coming on. You just took away everything a madman had to lose. What the hell are you going to use as his leash now? Author's note below. Chapter 1282. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:28 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 1282. Masterful. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1282. Masterful. Lionel's heart beat at a steady rhythm. His head tilted up to the skies. He seemed indifferent to it all for a moment, but it was only for a moment. In the next, a wide grin spread across his face. The feeling was all too familiar. Down a single score, with the entire field to go, the ball in his hands and everything dancing upon his palms, moving rhythmically under his control. He never loved playing football, but whenever those moments came, something within him would awaken. His mind would become sharper, his arm would become stronger, his gaze would become more piercing. But now those stakes were even higher. What was the worst that could happen on a football field? At worst he would just lose the game, and a blemish would be found on his perfect record. But what would happen here? His dreams would be cut off. His friends would suffer tragic fates and likely die. He would be humiliated, shamed, buried beneath stares of disdain and reminders of his own incompetence. That sort of feeling made his blood rush. It made his mind elevate to another level. His body tensed, then relaxed. His fingers flexed and stretched. The howling of his heart left a reverberating, but subtle beating quake dancing through the air. And then he vanished. When Lionel appeared again, he stood at the outskirts of the village, his eyes having snapped open to reveal two blinding orbs of violet, his hair standing on end and his aura blazing. His arms stretched out as though he was the conductor of an orchestra, little Tolliver appearing even as the corpses of dozens of beasts appeared at his feet. Lionel's gaze seemed to glaze over, his pupils flickering back and forth with an unfathomable speed, ricocheting back and forth within his eye sockets as though playing a game of pinball. Little Tolly wrapped around the corpse of a wolf, rising it up into the air. By that point, Lionel's palm had already flipped over, a spear appearing in his hands and flickering with a radiant gold spear force. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. His hand became nothing more than a blur, sweeping forward with such force that it wasn't even immediately obvious what sort of cut he had made. However, in the next instant, little Tolly seemed to have already reacted, pincering itself into the cut Lionel had formed and squeezing itself beneath the layer that separated skin and flesh. In the blink of an eye, the beast was suddenly stripped of its furry coat. Blood rained through the air, but just as quickly as it appeared, globules of cleansing waters manifested beneath Lionel's deft control. In one movement of his wrists, the pelt was washed of all blood and anarchic force, and in another movement, little Tolly was surrounded and completely cleansed. The contaminated cleansing waters were jetted out into the distance, but Lionel had already moved on long before it could even hit the ground. He repeated this exact same process dozens of times, his fingers forming whipping sounds in the air as they struck downward at an inconceivable speed, leaving nothing but blurs and cracks of wind in their wake. By this point, many of the youths of the three-pillar sector had awoken from their meditation to see what was happening. Though they were still about a day away from adjusting to the climate completely, they at least looked far better than they had in the past. At the very least, they could split their attention now as their bodies continued to acclimate, but seeing what was before them, many were completely unsure of how to react. Oddly enough, the only one who kept her eyes closed the entire time was Aina. If it wasn't for the light smile slowly spreading across her face, one would have thought that there may very well have been something wrong with her. But just the same, Lionel reacted as though he hadn't noticed any changes in his surroundings at all, the speed of his hands and fingers only becoming faster as his gaze blazed a brighter and brighter light. Held up by little Tolly, dozens of pieces of fabrics hung in the air. Lionel's mind flickered through the dream clone images of his companions, mapping out the most efficient method to use the pelts that hung before him, a process that took no more than just a single split second. Ho! Lionel's spear left sizzling whistles throughout the air as it snaked forward. Everywhere it passed by, another piece of fur would be cut down to size. In a blink, his spear had vanished, replaced by the delicate coil of a Forcecrafter's quill. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed compared to his other equipment. This quill had fallen the furthest behind. Its feather was a bit ruffled, the delicate outline of its black body and golden veins had dulled, and its tip had been ground down beneath continuous usage. And yet, when it hit Lionel's hand, nesting into his fingers and gently waving beneath the wind, despite the fact it knew this would be the last time it could work together with Lionel like this, it seemed to sing, its body releasing a radiant glow as though a final outcry to the world. The torches of Lionel's irises bloomed. He could feel that tug, a concept that had just barely eluded him before awakening right that moment. I will make sure the last craft you leave to this world is masterful. Lionel's wrist left an elegant arc through the air, a line of gold following his every pen stroke as a dense fog of violet hung around him, growing in size with every passing moment until the point a miniature humanoid creation emerged from his forehead. With a final flicker, Lionel's crafter's quill crumbled to ash, dancing into the wind and vanishing into the hovering pieces of fabric. A steamy breath left Lionel's lips, his heart pulsing with a steady rhythm. Little Tolliver's body seemed to vanish, concentrating into a long and thin sewing needle. Lionel's force erupted, forming a thin line of thread that sparkled in the dark atmosphere. Chapter 1283. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:28 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 1283. These materials. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1283. These materials. It seemed impossible. And yet Lionel's fingers only became faster and faster. The striking melody of his digits was so great that the air pressure rebounded against the tough ground, causing two hearty sounds to follow every single downstroke. Every movement he made was another unique and perfectly executed command to little Tolly. Their synergy reached another level, and the little metal spirit moved about so quickly that it seemed as though it didn't have any limits. Little Tolly had felt the final moment of the crafter's quill as well. Fueled by some unknown power and strength, the little guy went all out, its silvery body flickering with a subtle bluish hue that gave it all the more depth and character. The sewing needle little Tolly had concentrated itself into and the thin line of four-string Lionel had formed fused into one, the latter becoming the tail of the former. With this connection secured, little Tolly whizzed in and out of the fabric, sewing pieces together and formulating clothing of perfect proportions. Every time one finished, it would shoot out toward the person it was meant for, landing perfectly in their laps without the slightest issue. Was a tailoring technique that stood above others. Using little Tolly as a guide and his own four-string as the fuser, fabrics could be seamlessly combined as though they were always one. It completely eliminated weak points in a craft, and if the crafter was skilled enough, could even make it a strong point. The technique could be used on more than just fabrics as well. It could weld together metals and any inorganic materials Lionel might have to work with. Of course, it could only do this thanks to little Tolly's intrinsic property, and would be much weaker in the hands of someone who didn't have a metal spirit. But this wasn't exactly something Lionel had to worry about in the slightest. A rectangular strip of fabric bent around itself and formed the shape of a tube top. Little Tolly shot out from its bottom, winding up through it like a corkscrew and sewing both halves together. Blazing trails of blue were left in every which direction, numerous corkscrew-like formations being left hovering in the air long after little Tolly had long since left. Bang! The final strip completed. Still in a state of hyperactivity, Lionel began to put his own on. Every piece that touched his body seemed to carry an enigmatic air to it, making his blood rush. He felt that without a doubt, this was his greatest craft completed to this point despite the poor materials he had on hand. First came the bottoms. Lionel didn't seem to care in the slightest as he took his original beast skirt off, slipping on a new pair. Then he put on the ankle braces and the wrist braces, before finally slipping on a thin band that wrapped about his torso just below his chest. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com. Calm to experience faster update speed. The fur was a deep gray to black, and didn't cover much skin at all. But a pulsing sort of power seemed to rise when all the pieces were put together as one. And that was when it happened. A rushing black force surged out from the clothing. What sounded like the clink of armor resounded, alternating between a foggy blackness and the corporeal. Lionel's hair and face were enveloped by this black fog, the former seeming to grow out like a dancing river. His hands grew a size, becoming demonic claws, and his back suddenly began to grow out long tendrils of darkness, eerily similar to the preferred method of attack used by a particular cursed beast. Deep within the fog that now covered Lionel's hair and face, two orbs of red now hovered, seeming to pierce through any and everything before it. Power rushed through Lionel's as he raised his leg, stomping down hard. Slowly but surely, walls of earth began to rise, forming two protected sections. Change here. Beneath the black fog, Lionel's voice sounded several octaves too low, as though he was truly reaching out from the depths of hell. But just as he said this, the cloak vanished beneath his command, revealing the figure of a young man wrapped in beast cloth, as though what happened previously had never happened. The youths looked from Lionel to the beast's clothing in their hands. Did these really produce that? That strength? Where had it come from? How had he done it? Was such a thing even possible? No, maybe that wasn't what they should be focusing on at all. Let alone possible. How had it been done in such a short amount of time? For minutes. He had used just 4 minutes. Lionel slowly walked back into Village 0012. Despite the short amount of time he had left, it didn't seem like his steps were hurried in the slightest, almost as though he had all the time in the world remaining. The eyes that were on him now had changed drastically from just 5 minutes ago. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. Com to experience faster update speed. Fear, apprehension, wariness. These emotions suffused the air, and Lionel's indifference wasn't doing anything to help it in the slightest. Little Tolly bobbed above Lionel's shoulder, changing shape as it pleased and picking forms that only seemed more sinister with every passing moment. First the little one was a wolf, then a tiger, then a menacing grizzly bear, before finally becoming a silver dragon, coiling about Lionel's body before resting its head on his shoulders. No one seemed to understand what Lionel wanted to do, but that only made them more apprehensive. With how cruel this place was, couldn't he just snatch whatever he wanted from any one of them passing by? Even if the store clerks acted to stop him, there was only so far they would be allowed to take this. This was supposed to be a challenge for rookies. It wouldn't be much of a challenge if upper-year students could just act as they pleased. It was then that Lionel's body vanished. But what happened next was something that no one could have possibly guessed. Even Cornelius rose a palm to his forehead, closing his eyes and sighing. Bang! Lionel landed on top of the smithy, his heavy weight causing the shoddy construction to wave back and forth. He rose an arm into the air that instantly became enveloped by black fog, forming an enormous demonic claw as little Tolly snaked forward. Bang! Lionel's claws shot and clamped down, pulling at the highest log that formed the smith's roof and ripping it from its seams. He cast a gaze down, finding many pairs of eyes looking up from within the smithy with incredulous expressions on their faces. None of them could believe what they were seeing with their own eyes, however. Rubbing them didn't seem to change what was taking place in the slightest. Lionel's gaze met the very craftsman who had told him to roll out. His gaze filled with a dense coldness as he hoisted the log onto his shoulder before reaching down again and ripping out another thick log from the ceiling of the smithy. These materials. I'll be taking them. Anarchic force rushed into the smithy and down into the protective curtains, ruining the crafts they had been working on. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1284. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:28 and 9 seconds p.m. Chapter 1284. The rules of the Void Palace. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1284. The rules of the Void Palace. Gems was completely caught off guard. The craft he was diligently working on practically crumbled within his hand. His expression suddenly changed. With quick movements, he retrieved his fire spirit, storing it away before it could suffer too much beneath the anarchic force. Spirits were fragile beings, especially ones of lower quality and beneath a certain standard. The curtains weren't just important for protecting the privacy of the rookies they crafted for, but it was also a protective shield against the anarchic force that managed to make it through when the doors of the smithy opened. This way they could keep their spirits relatively safe. And yet, in a single action, Lionel had ruined all of that. He simply gave Gems a glance and jumped away, landing on another shop roof. With the same motion, he ripped out a ceiling log. The food stores beneath were immediately contaminated as Lionel balanced a third log on his shoulder, his indifferent glance sweeping downward without a care. His figure flickered and he appeared above another shop. This time, he landed on the tailor shop, a demonic hand ripping downward. Little Tolly acted quickly, rushing between the cracks that fused the logs together, and shattering all the connections it could before Lionel ripped out the rest. By the end of it, Lionel had 4 logs, each of at least 5 meters in length and about 1.5 feet to 2 feet wide. It was definitely much more than he needed, but he couldn't be bothered to care. He landed heavily on the ground just as several of the store clerks stormed out. Even the green-haired store clerk of the medicinal store Lionel had left alone for now rushed out, likely wanting to preemptively stop Lionel from doing something. But to her surprise, Lionel was already walking away. Right then, though, Lionel's steps came to a pause. He looked back to find a seething Gems and a few others. The young woman from the tailor shop who had been the first to ignore him, a girl who went by the name of Janin, was also among them. Lionel's actions had ruined several of the uniforms she had yet to properly seal and prime. How could she not be furious as well? This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. They hadn't come here for charity work. They came here to accumulate void points. Lionel's actions had made that practically impossible. They would have to fix the roofs first, but that would take work. And something told them it wouldn't be so easy to get the logs back from Lionel, meaning they would actually have to go and procure their own, something that was extremely difficult to begin with. Lionel had been correct in his assumptions. You weren't meant to cut down trees on your own. Even upper-ranked disciples found this to be extraordinarily difficult to do. Instead, you were meant to trade for the wood you needed with other resources. This wood would be far easier to work with than the raw wood one would find in the forest. Obviously, Lionel seemed to have guessed this and hadn't hesitated to ruin them. What? Lionel swept his gaze over them all one by one. You want to attack me? I'm right here. Do it. Lionel craned his neck back, holding up 4 logs on one shoulder, little Tolly glaring back menacingly on the other, and a deep, dense fog of black hanging around him. He truly looked like the bane of their existence. Gem's forehead vein nearly popped out from the skin that kept it under wraps. Though Janin seemed to look somewhat calmer, it was clear that she was having trouble controlling herself, as well as they both met Lionel's gaze. It was clear that Lionel knew quite well that there was nothing they could do. Refusing service was already at the very brink of the rules to begin with. Clerks like them were given this level of freedom, so that the rookies couldn't just act as they pleased. As Lionel had guessed earlier, the geniuses were far rowdier in the beginning than they were now. Everything looked peaceful, reserved and quiet. But that was only because enough had suffered at the hands of these clerks to know better than to try anything funny. Lionel hadn't been the first to be blacklisted. He was just the first to be blacklisted from all of the shops. And he was also the first that still dared to retaliate after suffering at their hands. It was clear and obvious to Lionel that this was all due to Orinik. As an upper-ranked disciple himself, it was quite easy for Orinik to get those here to believe in his words, and it was even easier when he didn't have to lie. Lionel knew that he had brought many of these things upon himself by accepting things he shouldn't have, but even if he had to go back in time, he would do it again. When it came to striving after his goal, he wouldn't allow anything to stand in his way, even if that thing was the dissatisfaction of others. He was confident in due to time that he would prove that regardless of whether he was worthy now, he would most definitely be in the future. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Still, He made a mental note of Orinik, his gaze flickering with a cold light. Seeing that the clerks weren't going to answer, Lionel turned and began to walk away. However, as he passed the green-haired woman of the medicinal store, Rosamond, "Even though you've spared my shop, I have no intention of serving you in the future." Rosamond's voice was just as calm, and even as it always was. She felt it was obvious why Lionel had spared her. No one dared to slight a healer you might need in the future. However, she only sneered inwardly, doubling down on her stance. Everything about Lionel disgusted her. The response she received in return, though, Lionel stopped level with her, looking down at Rosamond. The distance that separated their noses was maybe a foot or two. And yet despite their power imbalance, Lionel didn't flinch in the slightest. "You're overestimating yourself. The reason I didn't target your shop was to give those who haven't wronged me a lifeline to save themselves. However, I can say with great certainty that I will never need your services." That said, Lionel's gaze flickered with a depth of crimson light that shot out beams within the dull atmosphere of Village 0012. "I promise you that if one of my companions needs your help and you refuse them, the moment I'm strong enough, your head will be the first I take. The rules of the Void Palace will not stop me, that I swear." Lionel's words seemed to carry an enigmatic momentum to them, like an oath that was recognized by a higher power. The wind rushed by, swirling along the ground and causing miniature bursts of small cyclones. The anarchic force in the surroundings seemed to dim just the slightest bit, making everyone feel as though it was easier to breathe, and yet simultaneously making them not dare to take a breath at the same time. The violet in Lionel's hair and eyes flickered, the momentum of a king barreling forth. Rosamond's pupils constricted, her body frozen in place. Chapter 1285. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:28 and 8 seconds p.m. Chapter 1285. Beast Skin Armor. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1285. Beast Skin Armor. Lionel walked by Rosamond and left without another word. He didn't even care to look back after he was finished saying what he wanted. However, the eyes of the crafters turned clerks couldn't help but all focus on little Tali. They had all been so lost in their rage that they hadn't even noticed that Lionel actually had a metal spirit by his side, and he was actually letting it wrap around his body and wiggle about without even the slightest hint of protection. That second shock wasn't enough to override the first, though. Even in the Void Palace, a metal spirit was impossibly rare. There were thousands, tens of thousands of high-level crafters here, but they could all count on their hands and toes how many of them had a metal spirit by their side. And every single one of those individuals was from the Morales family. The Morales family was the only family capable of controlling such a dangerous spirit. When left to its own devices, and allowed to grow on its own, a metal spirit was no less a threat to human life than some of the most fearsome beasts and rival races in the whole of the dimensional verse. And maybe only the Earth variant affinity of the Morales met the requirements to tame such a beast. To see it being used so freely by a brat, and without the slightest precautions, they felt a cold chill creep up their spines. The crafter community of the Void Palace was an especially lofty place to be. It came with prestige, and it was about the only way for you to gain void points without putting your life on the line constantly. Even this mission here was an extremely precious one. That was why they were so enraged that Lionel had ruined it. But if it had to be said who held the greatest prestige among the crafter factions of the Void Palace, setting aside the super families that backed the crafter guilds, it was most definitely the Morales, and especially the Morales who wielded metal spirits. They suddenly understood now why it was that Orinik had never explicitly stated Lionel's last name. Although it could only be blamed on them. They simply hadn't cared. They were crafters and were arrogant by trade. Just the fact Lionel's mother was a sector-ranked disciple wasn't enough to sway them in the slightest. But this was very different. Rosamond eventually recovered from her shock, her gaze narrowing. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. The Morales family isn't the only family here. With that thought, she turned and returned to her storefront. Lionel worked just as fast with the logs as he had worked with the fabric. In fact, his goal with the logs were much simpler than what he had done with the fabrics, so he finished even faster, even after being delayed a moment. As expected, the prepared logs might have been softer than the trees outside the line of the village, but it also made it easier to cut and deal with. In addition, it managed to maintain some of its initial hardness as well, not losing out to many higher-tier fifth-dimensional metals. This hardness coupled with Lionel's force arts would allow his companions to have some of the best weapons amongst the rookies. Lionel finished just in time for the women to step out from their makeshift changing rooms, their elegant postures catching a lot of attention. If it wasn't for them knowing, or maybe hoping better, they would have thought that Lionel was a pervert with the ways he had designed their uniforms. However, regardless, they had to admit that the way it shaped to their bodies was very flattering and nothing was too small nor too big. They could only not think about how Lionel knew all their measurements so well too much. In truth, Lionel had wanted to give everyone more clothing to work with, but he hadn't killed many beasts. In addition, because he didn't act with thought of preserving their pelts, much of the fur was rendered unusable by him. So this was ultimately the only choice. As much attention as the women got when they stepped out, even with how pale and weak they seemed at this moment, it paled in comparison to what Aina received. The short beast's skin barely reached the middle of her thighs. Her toned belly was revealed, her every breath causing the faint outline of a powerful core to flash in and out of existence. Her chest was covered by a beast skin band, covering just enough of the lower and upper halves of her ample breasts. As scandalous as the main attractions of the uniform were, though the accessories were even more so. Lionel had used a fabric processing technique to form a pair of gray stockings for all of the women. The result somehow made Aina's long, slender legs even more attractive than they were initially. But what truly brought it all together was the beast skin choker that clung loosely to their necks, giving the design of the outfits an added touch of flair. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Lionel truly hadn't tried to make it all so scandalous. Without the choker, the armor lost its balance and was much weaker. It was the same reason he had a thin band running just beneath his chest. It wasn't for aesthetic purposes. He had gone for functionality first, though. He couldn't bear for them to not also look cool at the same time. And cool they were. Lionel walked to Aina, handing her a replica battle axe that looked identical to her own except for the fact this was formed of grayish-black wood. But surprisingly, she smiled lightly and shook her head, taking out her original battle axe. "It's fine, mine can hold up. Sorry for the trouble." Lionel's brow raised and he shook his head. It wasn't much trouble. It had only taken him a few seconds to form it. How could it be trouble? "Arnold, take this. Making your usual palm weapons is difficult with the material I have on hand right now. If they fail you, you can use this." Arnold nodded. "Quickly, I'll explain to you all the function of the beast skin armor." Aina stood silently by Lionel's side as he explained things. Just as Lionel finished the final word, chimes rang and they all looked upward. It seemed the true selection would finally begin now. Chapter 1286. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:28 and 6 seconds p.m. Chapter 1286. Markers and restrictions. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1286. Markers and restrictions. Lionel's gaze flickered. With a quick sweep, he took a mental note of the state of everyone. From what he could see, the closest to returning to their full strength were Miguel and Aina. But even then, they were restricted to about 20 to 30% of what they could do. It would take them at least another day or two before they were back up to their peak condition. As for the others, they were in an even worse state, most of whom could barely even stand on their own 2 feet. The likes of Noah, Carolus, Elther and, surprisingly, Savon had about 10 to 15% of their strength now. Lionel's gaze narrowed as he locked onto the pale-faced Yuri. The latter hadn't spoken to him, or even looked at him since they reunited. It wasn't that big of a deal to Lionel, as he was never truly close with Yuri to begin with, but it was clear and obvious that the latter wasn't very happy with him at all. This wasn't a very surprising turn of events. After all, even though he didn't show his face as they left, Lionel had felt a very dense killing intent lock onto him when he was leaving through the portal toward the Void Palace. And it was especially obvious when Aina called him king. So Lionel had already come to understand that the father-adoptive daughter pair hated his guts. That said, this wasn't the reason Lionel had locked onto Yuri at all. 100%. Yuri was in perfect condition. In fact, after scanning everyone here, Lionel was absolutely certain that she was only faking her current state. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Feeling Lionel's gaze, Yuri finally looked up to meet it. The flash of coldness that followed it made Lionel feel as though thousands of needles were piercing into his mind. However, he looked back unwavering. He didn't know why it was that Yuri was hiding herself like this, as he didn't know the truth behind her origins. But for the moment he chose not to expose her. He gained no real benefit from it, and in truth things might actually be an advantage in this way. Let's go. Activate your armors partially, it will help. Lionel turned his attention toward the center of the village, expecting for there to be some sort of prepared explanation or orientation. But he realized almost immediately that he had forgotten where he was. This wasn't some nice and cushy organization that coddled its disciples. From the moment they had stepped foot into this place, they had entered a death trap. The wall of black logs that formed a barrier of protection that separated village 0012 from the forest beyond was standing tall and proud in one moment, but in the next, the faint sounds of something large falling immediately caught Lionel's attention. But even within the walls of the village, the range of his internal sight was at most double what it had been in the forest before. There was simply no way for him to locate something his eyes couldn't lock onto. Very soon, though, he wouldn't have to. It started as barely a flicker of light in the dense fog that formed the canopy of the skies. But it very quickly became a blinding orb of fluorescence, shining as though a star was crashing down from above. Bang, 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 bang. The meteors crashed down, sending a wall of pressurized air out in all directions. Lionel was almost thrown off of his feet. He crossed a forearm over his face, his feet trying to dig into the ground, but finding that it was so hard that he couldn't find a firm grip anywhere. Luckily, the pressure wall didn't last very long, though the billowing clouds of dust that followed it didn't have the decency of doing the same. However, it didn't need to for Lionel to realize what had happened. This chapter upload first at novelbin.com. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. The wall, it was gone. Faster than even the clouds of dust, the fog rolled in, overwhelming everything from all directions and causing the concentration of anarchic force to multiply several times over. As much as the others had been struggling before, very soon, they would find themselves meeting a wall of opposition they wouldn't be able to walk out of. Now, Lionel's command roared out again. The others had been too shocked to act on his first call, but hearing his urgency, their sluggish minds snapped awake for a moment. Using what little strength they could muster, they poured their force into the beast skin armor Lionel had given them. They were all greatly apprehensive. After all, they barely had any strength remaining, so how could they easily accept using what little they had left in this fashion? However, there was something about the momentum of Lionel's voice that made them trust him. The moment they acted, the pieces of their beast clothing seemed to vibrate to a unique cadence, a dense black fog connecting them all and enveloping their bodies. Some gained powerful horns, others gained large claws, some had longer legs than more, while some gained longer arms, some even gained tendrils just like Lionel had. But what wasn't doubted was that each gained a large leap forward in strength. That, though, was just the tip of the iceberg. They felt the effect of the anarchic force lessen, allowing them to breathe easier and for their bodies to feel lighter. It also made the process of acclimation easier, although much slower. When the wall of fog finally made it to them, the horror they had braced for fell like a single drop of water amidst a vast ocean. They couldn't help but look toward Lionel's back with hardly concealed admiration and worship. What small reprieve they gained, expectedly, didn't last for very long though. Numerous pillars of light appeared in the distance. But it only took a moment for them to begin to thin, separating out into fine, thin and breaking lines of gold before vanishing entirely. Markers maybe? It was hard to gauge distance in all this fog, especially since they seemed to have purposely made every pillar the same thickness. Lionel only got a general direction out of them. The true selection begins now. All restrictions have been destroyed and cursed beasts are quite drawn to loud noises. I would advise you all get moving as quickly as possible. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1287. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:28 and 5 seconds p.m. Chapter 1287. Third, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1287. Third, almost the instant the voice came to an end, the howls of beasts shook the skies, penetrating the dense fog in a way that their eyesight couldn't hope to. The voice itself was clearly from Asena, but it was impossible to pinpoint where exactly she was. It was like she was trying to remind them all that she was paying attention to what was happening even if they couldn't set eyes on her. Lionel winced slightly, the loud howls threatening to burst his eardrums. The distance between them and the beasts shouldn't have been very close. He had already entered the forest once, and they were all quite dispersed, and he hadn't run into any packs, likely because the nature of cursed beasts didn't really allow them to work together. But for their roars to be so loud despite the distance, Lionel's heart couldn't help but skip a beat when he thought about just how powerful they had to be. We need to move. Now. Time was of the essence. This was the conclusion Lionel came to. The fact he could only make such a benign and unimpressive deduction spoke volumes all to its own. Lionel sent a gaze back, communicating with his eyes before shooting forward. He held back his speed to a level that most in their group could keep up with, not wanting to leave anyone behind. Though they now had the armor to sustain and help them, and they shouldn't have any issues maintaining it at these low settings, they were still restricted somewhat in their strength. The likes of Aina and Miguel could use about 80% now, while the others were at about 60 to 70%. Lionel blazed a path into the village, his gaze narrowing when he witnessed the scene ahead. In the center of the village, several of the most severely injured youth lay writhing on the ground, the anarchic force eating away at their weak bodies and paralyzing them from the inside out. It was clearly already too late for them to receive treatment, and one after another, they died. Even further ahead than that, a surging wall of disciples ran for their lives, understanding that they only had a short time to disperse into the forest before the wall that had protected them before became the bottleneck that assured their deaths. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. The issue with this, though, was that this small village already had several hundred geniuses who called this place home. Secondly, despite the large scale of the explosion, only about a 20-meter diameter of the black log wall had been destroyed. And to make matters worse, the residual force and flames of the impact still lay in the pit that separated them from their escape, forming a barrier that no one dared to cross easily. This resulted in a surge of people rushing from the back, and a wall of individuals who hesitated to take a step forward. Even on third-dimensional Earth, mosh pits were the kind of places innocent people went to die, let alone in a situation like this where people were on a high that surpassed seeing their favorite musician. They were all fighting for their lives. Lionel's gaze shifted from the hole in the wall to the portions of the black log that still remained. It was obvious that many weren't trying to leap over the normal way, because of how difficult it was to climb 100 meters straight up in a seventh-dimensional world. Can they make it? Lionel's brow furrowed deeper. He could clear the 100 meters in just a few steps, but what about those following him? It was unlikely. Lionel's mind worked in a blur, immediately coming up with a solution. His steps diverted, shooting off at an angle and away from the 20-meter gap in the wall. Careless with me. Careless expression changed, but he sped up until he was shoulder level with Lionel. His tall and lanky body was filled with strength and vitality, especially after gaining the support of Lionel's armor. He was eager to make his mark. Together, Lionel said, reaching out a hand. In that moment, a crack appeared in space about a meter off the ground. When Carolus saw this, he immediately understood, his own hand reaching out a moment later. With a thought, his own spatial affinity latched onto the ledge Lionel had formed, widening and strengthening it. Soon, the crack in space had become like a splintered glass stair, stretching out for about 2 meters. Lionel accelerated forward, his gaze flickering as he leapt into the air. Even as he did so, his hand reached out again, forming a second crack 3 meters ahead and 2 meters higher off the ground than the first. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. Carolus followed suit, his brows marred by concentration. Lionel's foot landed heavily on the first stair, propelling himself upward toward the second just as Carolus reinforced it. Their group caught on just a moment later, rushing up the spatial stairway in pairs as they rocketed upward. In just a few moments, they soared over the log wall beneath the astonished gazes of many of those who found themselves on the village side. "Slow your fall downward," Lionel's voice commanded again, a road of stars appearing beneath his feet as he zigzagged through the air, slowing his descent by several measures. Lionel's mind continued to work, his breathing becoming more even and his thoughts becoming focused. He knew the ins and outs of the abilities of everyone who followed him now. After all, while they thought they were anonymous thanks to the billboard of numbers, Lionel had already attached them all to faces. Using everyone quickly and efficiently wouldn't be a problem, so long as they hadn't held back too greatly. At that moment, though, Miguel landed heavily a large measure before Lionel had. Clearly, he hadn't taken any measures to slow himself, nor had he felt the need to. He looked up, meeting Lionel's gaze for a moment. Even without an exchange of words, Lionel already understood. Without a word, Miguel shot off into the distance, having no intention of waiting for the rest of them. Following Lionel? Was that a joke? A smile curled Lionel's lip for a moment before a shocked cry resounded, and a body flew out from the fog. Obviously, it wasn't Miguel, but rather, it was someone Lionel didn't recognize at all. Lionel landed on the ground softly, his gaze sharp as it pierced toward the direction Miguel had vanished from. Wisdom Branch, Third Awakening. Lionel's pupils dilated to an extreme, the illusion of an owl's eyes appearing to his back as his vision jumped through the dense fog to land on a group of disciples Miguel had just blasted through. Chapter 1288. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:28 and 3 seconds p.m. Chapter 1288. Barricades. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1288. Barricades. Lionel had recently stepped into the third awakening of his wisdom branch. Unfortunately, it didn't give him the boost to his mind that he had hoped for. But what it did do was give him a sharper pair of eyes that could see much further within this fog than his internal sight could. From just a few meters, Lionel's line of sight extended to about 50, allowing him to see what was going on. There had been many cabins much closer to the black log wall, and many of them were geniuses on a level beyond those still struggling to get past the wall of fire. So they had been able to clear the walls alone without relying on the tricks that Lionel had. They were likely talents that had either earned golden tokens, or had been very close to doing so. Some of these individuals had formed a barrier, blocking those who made it into the forest from continuing further in. This was a barricade that Miguel had come across, but he blasted through it as though it wasn't there. "I see. Thanks for the heads up." By the time Lionel had observed the situation and understood what was going on, Miguel had already vanished into the distance. It seemed that those that formed the barricade hadn't cared to chase after him either. Obviously, Miguel had thrown the body of this person back in Lionel's direction as a warning, knowing the poor vision everyone had in this fog. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. In Lionel's opinion, Miguel didn't have to do that. One might say that the latter owed Lionel because of the beast skin armor, but Lionel didn't feel that way. After all, it was his fault that everyone only had 3 hours to adapt. It was his responsibility to help them as a result, even if it was at a detriment to himself. Lionel didn't have close ties with many of those he was leading right now, but he still did so because he felt responsible. The beast's skin armor was what he owed Miguel. But it seemed Miguel didn't want to leave any question, and chose the path toward the cleanest separation possible. Toward this, Lionel could only chuckle to himself before his gaze became serious once more. One after another, those of the three-pillar sector landed to his back, some more heavily than others. Luckily, the foggy armor was able to mostly protect those who couldn't slow their falls by a large enough measure. Why would they block the road ahead? Shouldn't they be focused on running now? The beasts will be here soon. No, they're already here. Lionel's gaze flickered, roaming about the perimeter. There was no easy way to sneak more than 24 people through without running into one of these barricades. And as he had thought, the beasts were already here. There were small skirmishes breaking out everywhere. It was just that these beasts were still manageable for now, most being at Tier 1. This is a calculated risk by them. They know that the truly powerful beasts are still closing the distance. In that case, they must want to take advantage of the commotion to stock up on more resources. This is the best opportunity they have to rob people. There's no easy way to deal with this, and with Miguel gone, our battle prowess has definitely taken a strong hit. Prepare for battle. There's a blockade ahead, Lionel explained. After saying this, Lionel rushed forward again, his palm flipping over to reveal his spear. But surprisingly, he had brought out his quasi-bronze wind domain spear instead of one of his quasi-silver ones. Lionel had been very fond of this spear back when he was still in the third dimension. It was 4 meters long from head to toe and had a ridiculous amount of flexibility, granted by its hollow core revealed thanks to the etchings that coated its body, allowing one to see all the way through it in some sections. This chapter upload first at Novel.bin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel.next.com to experience faster update speed. Lionel hadn't claimed a quasi-silver spear like it just yet, so he had to settle for this one. But he felt it was perfect for this situation. With a shake of his wrists, the flexible spear vibrated wildly. In that moment, a surging of wind began to form a cyclone around its shaft, grasping onto the dense fog in the surroundings and bending it around Lionel's spear blade. Lionel's gaze flashed. As he rushed forward, he suddenly pierced forward a half-dozen times in quick succession. Every time he did, a dense, spear-force-laced, spiraling tendril of fog would whistle forward, casting a net of volatile strikes that shot toward a barricade. Aside from just the faintest of golden glows caused by Lionel's spear force, the attacks blended into the fog almost as though they weren't there at all. But what was the most devastating about them was the fact that halfway to their destination, the dense anarchic force within the fog began to swallow Lionel's spear force, increasing the concentration of anarchic force into the form of a blade that shot through the skies. Enemy attack. By the time a member of the barricade with sharper senses realized what was happening, Lionel's spear strikes had already arrived. Forced to hastily block, many brought their weapons up to their chests while others couldn't bring their weapons out in time, and were forced to block with their fists and arms. Unfortunately, no matter which category they fell into, the results were devastating. The dense anarchic force in Lionel's strike swallowed up the force they used to defend themselves, ripping through their defenses as though they weren't there. Those that used weapons ended up relatively better off, as these weapons had strong resistance to anarchic force to begin with, but those that didn't have the chance found their bodies pierced through and a violent anarchic force eating them up from the inside out. Lionel burst through the clearing, Aina and Noah following to his left and right as they all brandished their weapons. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1289. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:28 and 2 seconds p.m. Chapter 1289. Already? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1289. Already? Cornelius watched this skirmish with an odd flicker in his eyes. Already? Maybe only he knew what exactly he meant by this. Or, more accurately, those who understood the difficulty of fighting on a void battlefield would all come to a very quick comprehension of exactly what he was baffled by. Lionel's spear techniques flowed with a sort of smoothness it had never had before. This was the first time he had seriously used his spear since his battle with Miguel, and he could almost feel his every action singing, as though every slight movement carried with it a breath of fresh air, and a purpose filled with life and vitality. His 4-meter-long spear left afterimages in the air, melding with the surrounding fog as though there was no separation between them at all. Those that had managed to survive Lionel's sneak attack recovered quickly, brandishing their own weapons in retaliation. Lionel didn't hesitate to take on 3 of them, his blood pumping as his violet hair whipped about beneath his own sheer speed. His foot planted hard against the ground, his body shooting forward. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. For a moment, it looked as though he would crash right into a tree ahead of him. His 3 enemies cleverly used the congestion of the forest to their advantage, trying to recover from the sudden attack in time. But that was when Lionel's spear showed its flexibility. As though it had a mind of its own, it snaked around the tree from the left, appearing before the throat of the middle youth, who suddenly found themselves frozen in place. Lionel struck to kill, not showing even the slightest hint of mercy. Everything about his demeanor was oppressive and aggressive. He seemed to finally embody the true style of a spearman. His strikes were no longer bland, though they still carried a calculative air. It also came with it a certain liveliness that couldn't be denied, as though it was prepared to read and adapt to any situation in a split moment. "Move!" Lionel's voice boomed. The 2 to the side of the young man Lionel targeted reached out with their weapons to protect the throat of their comrade. But when their weapons struck the tip of Lionel's spear, they suddenly felt as though an overwhelming mountain had crashed down upon them from above. A strong flash of gold whipped outward, sending the flat of their blades careening against the throat of the companion they sought to protect, and resulting in all 3 of them flying backwards as though a triplet of broken kites. Lionel burst through the center of the barricade, his aura and movements becoming like a blinding torch for those to his back to follow. Aina and Noah followed through, the former brandishing an axe of red gold, and the latter wielding a gorgeous blue saber. It was clear that this saber was given to Noah by Alienor, or else it was doubtful that it would be able to survive in such an atmosphere. They were both just as ruthless as Lionel, Aina never having been a person who shied away from blood and gore, and Noah being no less murderous. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. What was different from this case in comparison to all others, though, was that the enemies they faced weren't cannon fodder. In fact, they were unlike any enemy they had ever faced before. Even with the intent to kill, Lionel had actually failed to do so, and Aina and Noah were no different. This place was where all the top talent of the human domain accumulated. They might have had their heads forcefully lowered and all their pride and aspirations watered down in the last several months, but for those had survived to this point, their strength had bloomed to a level it hadn't ever touched before. Lionel knew this well. This was why he hadn't hesitated to use a sneak attack to get through. A sneak attack he knew they would have to take advantage of, or else they would quickly find themselves on the losing side of this exchange. The only regret Lionel had was that he hadn't managed to come across good enough materials to make a bow, and he didn't have access to a bow he could use right now that wouldn't suffer under this anarchic force. He wasn't using the quasi-life grade bow for obvious reason. He knew that if he had had this bow, this battle would have ended even easier. In fact, in this fog, with his third awakening paired with his bowmanship, he would practically be untouchable. The person who suffered the most from this, though, was Isaac. Lionel Obvious hadn't been able to make him a bow either, leaving him stuck with nothing more to use than his own hands and feet. Luckily, as a bowman, his movement techniques were still quite good as he had to maintain distance from enemies. Lionel felt quite bad about this as he thought that if it wasn't for him, Isaac would have probably been able to commission the creation of a bow from the smithy. Unfortunately, things didn't end up working out in this way. Beyond this, Isaac was most definitely reluctantly following Lionel. After all, Lionel had killed his cousin. The only reason he hadn't left was because if he let a moment of pride and hatred ruin his selection here, he would be letting both Isaac and his family down. He owed it to them to do his best to survive until the day he could get revenge. Things weren't actually this simple, though. Lionel would soon come to learn that these matters weren't as much his fault as he thought. Bowman had a very special status in the Void Palace, a status that even often faintly surpassed that of craftsmen. It was also why the bow in Lionel's possession was so special. But this was a matter Lionel would likely find out sooner rather than later. The group finally burst through the barricade, vanishing into the thick fog on the other side. More coming October 5, 22. Chapter 1290. Published at 12th of October, 2022. 12:28 p.m. Chapter 1290. Spatial bristle bush cores. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1290. Spatial bristle bush cores. They passed already? What the hell were you all doing? Fuck you, where were you? I went to double check something. I had to after what I noticed, just in case he had left behind any of the spatial bristle bush cores. And nothing. He took it all. Tiske. You should have already known that after the first time you checked. Never mind that. It looks like he was already prepared for a barricade. We can't waste time here for too long. A beast tide has already formed, and we need to make it through before the real big shots get here. This is nothing like previous years. It's like they really want as much of us to die as possible. Even the storefronts already vanished by the time I got back. Lionel had noticed this as well. Not long after the voice announced the start of the true selection, the storefronts and their clerks had all vanished, likely to take part in the selection at a new location. But this also left those who needed things stranded while also making all the homes they had built useless. The ones talking right now were, of course, the Libra brothers Juan and Droit. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. After Lionel returned with an hour left, Juan had chosen to go out to check a few things. Since Lionel had managed to return unscathed, it was more likely than not that he had had some gains, and their initial estimation of him was wrong. He was definitely a threat to them monopolizing the rewards available to Village 0012. And they knew quite well that if they couldn't monopolize these rewards for themselves, they would end up at a disadvantage when facing other villages. While a lot seemed to have changed about this selection, the fundamental tenets of previous years were still here. They were still on their own, very little would be explained to them, and their main goals were to gather as much resources as possible while making it to the various checkpoints for any semblance of rest to be gained. Ultimately, they would have to make it up the mountain. It was just that simple. The trouble was that a mountain of the Void Palace, even the smallest, were easily taller than entire planets. This aside, the twins chose to take a cautious approach. After their own deductions and Orenic's informative talk with them, they had gotten complacent. But Lionel's return snapped them awake. They would only have one chance at this, they couldn't afford to waste it. And what Juan found on the outside proved him right. The destruction left by the spatial bristle bushes wasn't something Lionel could easily cover up even if he wanted to. Seventh-dimensional worlds were incredibly sturdy, so any damage to the surroundings at all were quite rare, especially in a region limited to fifth-dimensional existences. So when Juan found several deep pits of violent spatial chi, each at a location of spatial bristle he was familiar with, his pupils couldn't help but constrict. Harvesting the spatial rings the two brothers had done every few days. But even after more than 2 months, they had only managed to gather less than 10 between the both of them. Yet somehow, if Juan was correct, Lionel actually had hundreds in his possession. The kind of buying power such a thing represented was enough to make him salivate. The two brothers had been certain that the encirclement would be enough to slow them down. And because they didn't want to alert Lionel, they had chosen to remain in the shadows and wait for an opportunity. But it was clear that they had gravely failed in doing so. What exactly happened? What's his strength? What weapon does he use? What's the damage? It seems to have been a surprise attack. He uses a spear and it's definitely not one constructed by the smithy, which means he has a weapon that can survive in this atmosphere without special refinement methods. Or it was already specially refined for him. In addition, That beauty and one other also seems to have weapons like that. 3 of them. Juan frowned deeply. There was no such thing as fairness in the Void Palace. The things that others had that you didn't, you would have to rely on yourself to get. But so many individuals with weapons capable of surviving anarchic force was unheard of. This chapter upload first at Novelbin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. The 2 brothers fell into this category of people, of course. However, they had thought that they would be the only 2 of this village to have this luck. But it seemed that they were wrong. The damage is pretty bad. 3 succumbed to their injuries and died, all of whom seemed to have been hit by an odd elevated concentration of anarchic force. It's hard to tell if it was intentional, or if they were just unlucky. Do you think we could get them for murdering fellow disciples? You know, if it was against the rules they would have already stepped in. The true selection is much less policed in this fashion. If it's like other years, there's free rule outside the safe zones and rules are only enforced within them. Juan nodded, having already known this. The beast tide is already here. They still don't know we're targeting them. It'll be easier to get through this wave of beasts if we combine efforts in the vanguard. However, I'm not giving up those spatial rings. Even setting aside the bush cores, that many spatial rings is enough for us to practically buy our way to the peak. We have Orinik to thank. If not for him talking to the seniors, he would have already exchanged them. But we can't relax. There's far more to trade for at higher level safe zones. The 2 brothers looked toward one another and nodded in unison, shooting off toward the sounds of howling beasts. Lionel's gaze sharpened. His dilated pupils saw an endless wall of beasts rushing toward them. Just in a 50-meter radius from him, the numbers were already in the hundreds. His mind went into overdrive. How could he get out of this without casualties? The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1291. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:27 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1291. Useful if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1291. Useful. The first issue was line of sight. Even being able to see 50 meters ahead felt a lot more like half of that. The trees were very dense and maneuvering about was a problem, making a straight line of sight impossible to maintain for too long. With such a short line of sight, and lacking the flexibility provided by internal sight, Lionel couldn't even tell how far they had to go, or if there was even an end to all of this to begin with. The second problem was the strength of the beasts. Lionel had fought many Tier 1 cursed beasts already, and their strength was nothing to turn your nose up at. In fact, it was directly the opposite. Facing one was a challenge enough already for most, let alone facing a horde like this. Of those in his group, Lionel was certain that a majority would only be able to handle, at most, a single cursed beast at a time. And that led to his third problem. There were simply too many of them for him to defend and protect by himself. It would be fine initially as all the cursed beasts were currently in front of them, but Lionel wouldn't be able to kill them all. As they got further and further into the beast tide, they would begin to receive attacks from the sides and eventually the back as well. At that point, I will take your right. Aina suddenly spoke. Lionel's gaze flickered. That was right. He wasn't exactly alone. I will take the left. Noah followed up. I want the front. Elther chimed in, eager to lead the vanguard. But he found an arm wrapped around his, pulling him backward. Well, take up the rear. Carolus corrected. So long as you move forward fast enough, we won't be swarmed too badly. Carolus flashed a smile, but it almost seemed quite fanatical as he looked toward Lionel. Everyone had already gotten used to this, though. After Carolus exposed himself as a fanboy of the Royal Blue football team, he had gotten worse and worse at hiding his love for Lionel. This chapter upload first at Novelbin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed toward this though, Lionel grinned. It seemed he had been a bit too focused on making it up to everyone. Then again though, he was always like this. If there was something he could take control of himself, he rarely relied on others to do it. With a flip of his palm, Lionel's wind domain spear vanished. He once again lamented the loss of his duality spear. It would have been far too useful in this situation. But he had to make do with what he had. Kinetic spear. A spear of what looked like black ice appeared in Lionel's hands, a dense black fog erupting around him as he took a heavy step forward. Everyone else, gather in the center. Keep your head on a swivel and support where you can. As Lionel was speaking, his head was enveloped by the fog and his voice fell several octaves, the reverberating baritone thrumming the trees vibrating to the stampeding beasts to life. Little Blackstar hopped into the air, dancing about on invisible steps before shooting forward. Keep up, Blackstar, and I will carve the path out. Bang! Lionel shot after Little Blackstar, his body forming an arrow of force as he crashed into the front line of berserk cursed beasts. As though a wedge, Lionel's volatile use of force caused a 3-meter diameter to split wide open amidst the surging tide, the sturdiness of his back suddenly becoming the marker for all those behind him. TCH. Elther shook his head. Should have been me. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext. Com to experience faster update speed. Carolus laughed. Would better hurry up or else would really be left behind. With every movement of his spear, another cursed beast fell. Lionel had learned from his mistakes previously. Cutting down these beasts wasn't enough. He had to shatter the source of their strength as well. Due to the mutation the cursed beasts had undergone, their ethereal glabellas, or rather, their beast crystals, vanished, fusing into their bodies and becoming various physical mutations. If you wanted to ensure that one was dead, you would have to target this location and tear it apart as it acted as a second brain of sorts. This was why the wolf was able to attack Lionel, even after he bisected it. Obviously, Lionel wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Each one of his strikes was lethal to an extreme. Sometimes he would seem to shatter a beast whole. At other times he would only cut off a small piece of their heads, but regardless of what he did, they would always never rise again. Little Blackstar didn't even seem to treat this like a real battlefield, and the little guy acted as though he was on some sort of elaborate, hyper-realistic playground. The little mink hopped through the air, vanishing on a whim and appearing as he pleased. Every time he did so, another head would be ripped from a body. Somehow, even though the little mink wasn't as meticulous as Lionel in attacking the second brain, whomever he attacked would still never rise again. Shadows of all sorts danced and bobbed in the air. But Little Blackstar simply swallowed them all, happily chewing along as though enjoying a great delicacy. Lionel left Little Blackstar to his own devices, and yet the two in combination were still like a buzzsaw, twisting through the tide of beasts. However, even after an hour, there was no end in sight. The looming threat of the more powerful beasts hung over their heads like a guillotine. But even before they arrived, Lionel could already feel that the resistance of the beasts ahead was growing. He had to keep up the same forward pace, or else they'd be completely swallowed up. But the number of Tier 2 beasts they were coming across had already increased exponentially. Lionel had even locked gazes with a Tier 3 just 20 meters ahead. Lionel still felt like he could go on for a long while, but the same couldn't be said for those behind him. With a thought, a necklace appeared around Lionel's neck, this time tied by beast skin. It seemed there would be nothing easy about this. It was time for his second beast companion to be useful. Chapter 1292. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:27 and 57 seconds p.m. Chapter 1292. 0. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1292. 0. Lionel actually wasn't sure if the golden scaled koi fish would be able to do this. While it had shown a great amount of talent in siphoning and parsing force, not only was this world far stronger than any it had experienced before, but it was also filled with a force that Lionel wasn't sure the koi fish would be able to deal with. It was because of these reasons that Lionel had hesitated to take this risk before, but now he felt like he had little choice. While he himself was doing fine and could continue without pause for at least a few more days, those that followed him weren't doing nearly as well. They had already used the last sliver of their force to power the beast's skin armor. And while the function of the fog armor allowed them to slowly replenish themselves over time, the issue was that the process was slow, especially when they had to immediately use whatever headway they made to fight the beasts that were surrounding them from all sides. Once again, this was ultimately Lionel's fault for not allowing them all enough time to acclimate. While the likes of Aina seemed to be taking this as a great training opportunity, relying on her overwhelming bodily strength to support herself, the others weren't so masochistic, nor did their bodily compositions allow them to be. Alright, you mass-murdering little fish, it's time to be useful. Lionel's gaze flashed. Worst come to worst, the koi fish was swimming around in a lake's worth of sixth-dimensional cleansing waters. Even if it didn't have the skill necessary to piece apart the force properly just yet, its life shouldn't be on the line immediately. Lionel didn't need anything crazy, he just wanted to shift the concentration of anarchic force in the general surroundings, just enough that the burden on the others was lessened to the point that they could recover. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net if you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. The golden scaled koi fish, still very much afraid of Lionel, didn't dare to delay, quickly doing as it was told. Unfortunately, things weren't as rosy as Lionel hoped them to be. The moment the fish began to act, Lionel could feel that anarchic force was being pulled along. Though Lionel used his connection with the koi fish to try and command it to separate it out, he soon realized that this was beyond the little fish's abilities. Damn it! Lionel's jaw clenched, his spear jetting outward and leaving streaks of gold in the air as he pressed forward, shredding apart every beast that got within even a 2-meter radius of him. Without a choice, he was forced to make the koi fish stop. If he had allowed it to continue, let alone increasing the concentration of usable force, Lionel would end up doing the exact opposite. In the end, he would be killing his team faster. If only I could use a domain. If Lionel could blanket the surroundings, it wouldn't be a problem, he would be able to cover for everyone at the same time. His chain domain would be absolutely perfect in this situation. The issue was that even if Lionel brought out all the stops, even fusing his king's might into his domain to expand its size, it would still barely stretch out a few inches from him. Let alone covering for more than 24 people, he wouldn't even be able to cover for himself. In this world, the range of his domains was simply far too small. There were only a few ways to change this. The first was to break into the 6th dimension. The second was to raise his mind to the 6th dimension, and thus increase the pressure his king's might could exude. The third was to comprehend the heavenly body realm to completion. The universal force it would provide would make his domains more than large enough. The fourth option was to enter spear domain and pull out a quasi-gold spear, not to mention hope that it would acknowledge him and help him to use its domain instantly. Lionel thought of many solutions, but each one was more impossible to use than the last. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net if you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Then that only leaves one choice. It was a nice sentiment to want to pool the efforts of everyone together, but it was simply not possible. There always comes a time when others reach their limits and Lionel would just have to put in more effort to cover for them. The crimson orbs that hovered within the dark fog that was Lionel's helmet vibrated. In that moment, a miniature humanoid figure of violet appeared above it, its purple hues fusing into Lionel's dark armor and giving it an added sinister air. The moment Lionel fused the influence of his king's might with his internal sight, its range amplified. From just a handful of meters, Lionel could finally see the surrounding 20 with extraordinary clarity. Tendrils of darkness erupted from Lionel's back even as little Tali appeared once more. In its draconic form, little Tali snaked toward the corpses that littered the surroundings of Lionel's feet, shredding them apart and leaving nothing more than the bones behind. Lionel shifted his spear into one hand, using his left to strike at the air with his fingers. The precision with which Tolliver was being controlled skyrocketed, the little metal spirit's actions becoming more refined and deft. Soon, the sturdy bones of the fallen beasts were refined into sharp daggers without a hint of specialness to them. They seemed unassuming and weak. Until, that is, little Tali threw them into the air, allowing the tendrils that had erupted from Lionel's back to snatch them. Level 2 bow force bloomed, coating the blades of these daggers with a subtle hint of lethality that chilled the bones. Lionel's left hand danced through the air, his right controlling the killing spree of his spear, eruptions of golden level 2 spear force slicing apart everything in its path, and finally, the whipping sounds of dark tendrils snapping through the wind followed by harsh whistling filled the battlefield. With a single flick, dozens of bone daggers jetted outward in all directions, each one reaping the life of a cursed beast. A heated breath left Lionel's lips as the pressure on everyone around him dropped to nearly zero. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1293. Published at 12th of October, 2022, 12:27 and 56 seconds p.m. Chapter 1293. Headache. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1293. Headache. Lionel's killing speed skyrocketed. He controlled everything within a 20-meter radius. Every dagger his tendrils threw reaped another life, and every swing of his blade bisected another body. His mind was in overdrive, and his killing was so efficient that those nearer the back suddenly found that they had nothing to contribute. Even Noah and Aina, who had taken on the brunt of the pressure with Lionel, found themselves withstanding less than 20% of the initial hardship. Lionel seemed to be both in tune with the world and completely ignorant of it at the same time. His ears heard nothing but soft whistles, his eyes fogged, blurring much of his vision, his sense of touch dulled as the hairs of his skin stood on end. And yet, he seemed so much sharper at the same time. Shuu, shuu, shuu. Every dagger twisted through the air as though it had a mind of its own, wrapping round trees, ducking beneath paws, twisting past attacks. Without fail, each and every time Lionel struck out, another cursed beast would fall. And somehow at the very same time, Lionel only became more and more efficient. The daggers took less winding turns in the air. The reactions of the beasts seemed to become slower as he began to target their blind spots. And from time to time, a single dagger would take out two beasts at once instead of just one. At first, the group was huddled into a 5-meter diameter at best. But as Lionel's mind sunk further and further, the breathing room increased again and again. Soon, there was easily a 5-meter separation between their line of defense and the next onslaught of beasts. And then it became 10. Then 15 at that moment. Lionel jolted, a sense of warning coming to his mind. It was an instinctual sort of feeling, the kind a general would get when the tides of battle were about to flip. Lionel wasn't too surprised by this. From time to time, whenever he had to use bow force on a large scale, he would subconsciously slip into the style of that fire elemental woman he had seen in the Valiant City on terrain. Her command of the battlefield was unlike anything he had seen even to this point, so he dabbled and tweaked this style to his liking depending on the situation. But now this style was screaming at him that he was going too far. Lionel's mind lit like a spark. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed at this moment. They were a drop in the ocean. But if he expanded their range of influence too much, their drop would become a wave, and eventually the ocean itself would bite back. If more and more of the beast tide focused on them, they would be in trouble. The second issue was, Lionel's dagger whipped out. But before it could make it to its destination 20 meters away, it lost all its momentum, the anarchic force sapping away everything it had. There was a reason that Lionel had swapped his wind domain spear out. Using blade-like anarchic force was effective on humans, but to cursed beasts, it was like a midday snack. It wouldn't hurt them at all. If the distance his bone daggers had to travel was long enough, the result would be just like this. It would be stripped of its bow force, and not only would Lionel's control waver, but the resulting impact, even if by some miracle it landed, wouldn't even be a fraction the result he would hope for. Lionel's gaze flickered, taking deep breath. The heat coming off of him was palpable, and it only seemed to make the fog denser. Sometimes being too efficient and powerful was a problem. He needed to find a balance. Only like that could he not only maximize his rest time, but also ensure that they didn't draw too much attention. It didn't take long for the beast tide to quickly fill in the gap. After ensuring that they hadn't pulled too much aggros, Lionel sighed in relief and focused his attention on the Tier 3 beast that had swallowed up the distance between them. Natural bow force? No, normal natural bow force couldn't possibly travel as much as 20 meters in this density of anarchic force, and definitely not with that level of control and deftness. What is this child hiding? This was the true secret of bow force and the Void Palace. Long-ranged attackers were so rare that the status of bowmen who would be effective in this environment were countless levels above others even of similar skill level in other areas. This was a simple application of supply and demand. A bowman that could be effective at 20 meters was already enough for the Void Palace to go all out in protecting. Even if Lionel had no background whatsoever, Cornelius would likely swoop down from the skies right this moment and take him out of this trial. Unfortunately, out of consideration for some other things, he definitely couldn't do this. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. A Morales family youth with natural bow force at such a young age. How will the Terrius family react to this? Not only that, but he's already awakened the Morales family's elevated spear force. Why did they throw this problem on my lap? Cornelius had sighed more times today than he had in the last several decades. The upper echelon of the Void Palace was split. However, regardless of which side they were on, they were in unanimous agreement that they didn't want another Velasco appearance. That man had a unique method of pissing off everyone, and yet somehow still managing to be so beloved. The result of this was an odd push and pull effect where they wanted to take a hands-off approach with Lionel, but also didn't want him to run rampant to the point where that Death Star could appear here again. In order to do that, they needed to make sure that Lionel stayed within the confines of the rules, and that he integrated as normally as possible. This was minimize the risk. The odds that Velasco's son would be as much of a blazing sun as his father was low, despite what Asena had to say about genetics. Unfortunately, the more Cornelius observed Lionel, the more confused he got. He couldn't tell if Lionel was a once-in-a-several-generation genius like his father, or if he was an ordinary talent riding the coattails of his family's resources. Even now he had still not yet made a decision, but regardless, this matter was trending poorly for the Void Palace. Lionel's gaze brightened. There's an odd sparsity of beasts ahead, and the flow seems to have been diverted. There's definitely a change up ahead within the next half-kilometer. Lionel had made certain to follow a path that led toward one of those golden pillars he had seen at the start of the trial, but he had no way of telling just how far away they were. He now had a feeling that he was approaching them. What he hadn't realized yet, though, was that he had a few tails that were outside the range of his amplified internal sight. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.